Hello friends, about of the friends who watch my videos are not subscribed, and I would be really happy if you do so. Also, don't forget to hit the like button and leave your comments. Your interaction makes the content reach everyone and contributes to the growth of the channel. Thank you. Her story I gotta tell. It's been eating at me for a decade, this memory that just won't let go. It's about this crazy trip I took with my friends to an abandoned logging camp in the Alaskan wilderness. It was the summer of 2005, and we were all fresh out of college, ready for adventure. My buddy Mark was obsessed with this old logging camp he'd found on some ancient maps. He was convinced it was this untouched piece of history, just waiting to be explored. It'll be epic, Mark kept saying, his eyes all lit up. Just us, the mountains, and a whole camp to ourselves. The camp was way out in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by this overgrown mining road that cut through miles of forest. The logging companies had given up on the place decades ago. The trees were too big, too remote, not worth the effort. They just left everything behind. Mark had found it while researching for his history degree, and he was determined to see it for himself. He'd already convinced his girlfriend Julie to go with him, and now he was trying to rope us in. Come on, it'll be an adventure, he pleaded. Think about it. We'll be the first people there in over 50 years. Julie looked a bit hesitant, but she was smiling at Mark like he was the only guy in the world. Our friend Steve, though, wasn't buying it. You're crazy, man, he said, shaking his head. Why would we hike all that way just to see some abandoned shed? It's more than a shed, Mark insisted. There are bunkhouses, equipment, even an old steam locomotive. Steve still wasn't convinced, but Jake and I were starting to get interested. As Julie and Mark debated, I looked up at the Alaskan night sky. The stars were incredible, brighter than I'd ever seen them before. Maybe it was the wilderness vibe, but suddenly, the idea didn't seem so crazy anymore. Look, you really think it's still there? Jake asked. Couldn't it have collapsed or rotted away by now? Mark shrugged. Who knows? Even if the camp is gone, think of the hike. When's the last time any of us did something like this? I felt this restlessness wash over me. We'd just graduated, and the future was looming. Job hunting, rent payments, the whole 9 yards. I don't know about you guys, I said, but I'd rather try to find some abandoned locomotive than start filling out job applications. Jake laughed. All right, I'm in. Let's do this. Steve groaned, but he finally gave in. Fine, he said. But if we get eaten by bears, I'm blaming you, Mark. We spent the next week planning and gathering gear. Mark was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement, and the way he was looking at Julie, it was clear this trip was about more than just exploring some old camp. Early one Saturday morning, we loaded up Mark's SUV and headed for the mountains. As we left the paved roads behind, I felt a mix of excitement and doubt. Were we really cut out for this? The mining road was rough, but Mark's SUV handled it like a champ. We bumped along for miles, the forest getting denser and denser. No turning back now, Jake said, and I could hear the nervousness in his voice. As the sun started to set, Julie asked, shouldn't we camp soon? But Mark was determined to keep going. We drove on, headlights cutting through the darkness, until we finally emerged into a clearing, and there it was, the abandoned logging camp. It was incredible. This huge barn-like structure, bathed in moonlight. We just sat there, speechless, taking it all in. We were the first people to see this place in decades. We reached the logging camp in the late afternoon. The shadows from the trees were already getting long, but we could still see the whole place clearly. Jake let out a low whistle as he took in the sight of the decaying buildings. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "It really is still here." There were 3 big bunkhouses, a massive barn, and a bunch of rusted machinery scattered around. At the far end, we could see the metal frame of a steam locomotive, half hidden by bushes and weeds. "Told you guys this would be epic," Mark said, grinning. "Now let's find a spot to set up camp before it gets dark." We drove to a flat area near the trees and unloaded our gear. The air was damp, and mosquitoes were swarming around us like crazy. "These things are vicious," Steve complained, swatting at his neck. "Mark, there better not be mosquitoes like this the whole time we're out here." Mark just laughed. "We're in their territory now. Just keep spraying that bug spray." Once the tents were up, we went to gather firewood. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It already felt different from any other place I'd been. Steve got a fire going in a stone fire pit, and we huddled around it as the sun went down. We ate our simple dinner of beans and hot dogs, feeling the warmth of the flames chase away the evening chill. "To adventure," Mark said, raising his tin cup of whiskey. We clinked our cups together and laughed. The whiskey warmed me up from the inside, and soon we were swapping stories and jokes. Mark kept scooting closer to Julie on the log they were sharing, and she was leaning into him with a smile. Seeing them like that made me miss my own girlfriend back home. "All right, I gotta know," Jake said, turning to Mark. "How'd you convince Julie to come out to this abandoned camp with you?" Julie blushed, and Mark grinned. "Let's just say I can be very persuasive. I just asked her to go on a crazy adventure with me," Mark said, giving Julie a quick kiss. "Who could say no to that?" "Well, I think Julie needs to be checked for insanity," Steve joked. We all laughed, but there was still this underlying tension. We were out in the middle of nowhere after all. As the fire died down, I started to feel exhausted. We'd been driving and hiking all day, and my sleeping bag was calling my name. "Good night, guys," I said, yawning. I crawled into my tent and snuggled into my sleeping bag. The nylon walls of the tent crinkled in the breeze, and the voices of my friends faded away as I drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, I woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the campfire. The woods were bathed in moonlight, and I could hear my friends still chatting and joking. I smiled to myself, feeling happy and comforted, and drifted back to sleep. The next morning was damp and gray. A thick mist hung between the trees, muffling all sound. I quickly pulled on my boots and jacket, eager to get to the fire. My friends were already up, huddled around a small fire Steve had rekindled. We drank our instant coffee, shivering in the morning chill. "So, what's the plan today?" Julie asked. Mark blew on his hands and looked towards the old buildings. "I want to check out those bunkhouses and see if there's any equipment left inside." Steve groaned. "You mean we have to move? Can't we just sit by the fire all day?" "Come on, we didn't come all this way just to sit around," Mark said. We finished our coffee and followed him across the clearing. Our boots crunched on the gravel and broken glass as we approached the dilapidated bunkhouse. The front door creaked open, revealing a large room filled with debris. "This must have been where the workers lived," Mark said, his voice echoing in the empty space. The bunk beds were falling apart, and there were no mattresses or blankets. An old wood stove stood against one wall, covered in dust and cobwebs. "No one's cleaned this place in a long time," I said, running my finger through the grime on a windowsill. Julie wandered over to a shelf filled with cracked dishes and cups. "Strange to think people used to wake up here every morning, make coffee, go to work," she said. "All these years later, just left exactly as it was," Steve added. He scratched at some peeling paint on the wall. Mark peered into a locker. "Wonder if these would still fit any of us," he said, grinning. Jake was looking at an old typewriter on a desk. Scattered around were weathered notebooks. "Looks like these were the loggers' daily reports," he said. "This one is dated August 13th, 1949. Says, cut down 25 spruce today, mostly young growth. Mosquitoes fierce near the ridge." He trailed off, carefully turning the pages. A strange silence fell over the room as we imagined the workers writing by lantern light, swatting mosquitoes, their daily lives recorded in these crumbling notebooks. I noticed some old photos on the wall. They were black and white pictures of lumberjacks posing with huge logs. "Tough-looking bunch," I commented. Mark nodded. "They had to be, to work in these conditions every day." I stared at their weathered faces, trying to picture them sitting around at the end of a long day, playing cards and smoking. They were just ghosts now, captured in these fading photographs. "Crazy how this was all just left behind," Steve said. Julie shivered. "It does kind of feel like we're trespassing, seeing all this." We were quiet again, thinking about the people who had lived and worked here. A half-played chessboard on an overturned barrel, initials carved into a bedpost, stacks of old newspapers, echoes of lives long gone. "We should probably get moving," Mark said, breaking the silence. "Still more to explore out there." I took one last look around the gloomy room before following my friends back outside. As we walked, I glanced back at our tents. Something about the campsite looked different. I stopped and turned to get a better look. There, among the trees surrounding our tents, were strange markings carved into the trunks. "Hey guys, check this out," I said, pointing. "What is it?" Jake asked. "There's something carved on those trees near our tents. Can't really make it out from here, but it looks weird." We walked over to get a closer look. As we got nearer, the markings became clearer. They were definitely not natural. Intricate symbols and lines had been carved into several of the tree trunks. "Whoa, these are creepy looking," Steve said, leaning in to examine one. It looked vaguely Celtic, with loops and spirals gouged deep into the bark. Mark ran his hand over another symbol, a circle with a line through it. "These almost look like runes or something," he said, glancing around uneasily. "Were these here when we arrived yesterday?" I shook my head. I don't remember seeing any strange markings. I think I would have noticed something like this near our tents. We exchanged nervous glances. The forest suddenly felt a lot more ominous. Who could have done this overnight? And what did the strange symbols mean? "Maybe it was another camping group passing through," Julie suggested, but she didn't sound convinced. Mark examined a few more of the marked trunks. "I don't know. These look pretty deliberately carved, not just some random vandalism." The symbols gave me an uneasy feeling, like we were being watched. I half expected to see someone peering out from behind the trees, but all was still and silent. "Fan out, guys," Mark said. "Let's see if there are any more around here." We spread out, searching for more markings. "Found another one over here," Jake called out. We gathered around the deeply etched symbol he was examining. It was a simple circle with a diagonal line through it, different from the Celtic-looking ones. "This is really strange," I muttered. "Who would come all the way out here just to do this?" Mark shook his head. "I know. I was excited to find this camp, but I can't imagine another group hiking all the way out here just to carve up trees." We kept searching and found more carved trunks, leading away from our campsite and into the dense forest. They seemed to follow a winding path. I felt a shiver run down my spine as we passed a birch tree, etched with a symbol that looked like a spider. Something about these markings disturbed me, like a warning sign in an ancient language. "Guys, I don't like this," Julie said, her voice trembling. "It's like someone was leaving a trail right to our campsite." "Yeah, this is all really creepy," Steve agreed. "Any chance this is your idea of a prank, Mark?" Mark held up his hands. "You really think I'd sneak around carving spooky symbols on trees? This wasn't us." That only deepened the mystery. We were miles from any roads or trails. Was someone else out here in these remote woods? The whole atmosphere felt different now, charged with an unsettling energy. I wanted to pack up and leave, but at the same time I was captivated by the strange symbols. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were clues to something bigger, even if my rational mind resisted such thoughts. Mark pulled out his hatchet and tapped it against a tree trunk. "You know, I'd like to follow this trail a bit and see where it leads. Maybe we can figure out who's doing this." Steve looked like he was about to bolt. "Yeah, I don't know, man. Maybe we should just leave it alone." "I'm with Steve," Julie said, her face pale. "This feels wrong. Let's just go." Mark looked at Jake and me, his eyebrows raised. I understood Julie's fear, but the mystery was too tempting to ignore. "I say we see where the trail leads," I said, ignoring Julie's worried sigh. "As long as we stick together and stay alert. But no splitting up." Mark grinned. "You got it. We'll track this just a bit and see if we can spot anyone else out here." With Jake and me on board, Steve reluctantly agreed to come along. Safety in numbers, I guess. I could tell Julie was nervous as we followed the trail deeper into the shadowy forest, but she stayed close to Mark, her jaw set in determination. We hiked for what felt like hours, the trail winding through the dense forest. The symbols we followed were getting weirder and weirder, intricate patterns carved deep into the bark, some fresh, some old. It was definitely deliberate, not just random vandalism. I kept glancing around, half expecting to see someone watching us from the trees. The normal sounds of the forest seemed muted, replaced by an unsettling silence. "This place gives me the creeps," Julie said, shivering. "Those symbols, the trail. It's like something out there is watching us." Mark put a comforting arm around her. "We don't know that for sure. Could just be some weird local tradition we're not aware of." But he didn't sound convinced. "I'm with Julie," Steve said, his voice shaky. "This is seriously freaky. I say we get the hell out of here first thing tomorrow." I stared into the trees, torn between fear and curiosity. "What do you guys think the symbols mean?" I asked. "Maybe it's some kind of ancient language," Jake suggested. like a lost native tribe or something, living out here. Steve snorted. A lost tribe? Come on, man, this isn't a cheesy movie. Hey, you got a better explanation? Jake shot back. Steve just shook his head and went back to nervously whittling a stick. It is pretty remote out here, I said slowly. If some group wanted to disappear, I imagine these woods would be perfect for it. Mark nodded. I've read about hermits and holdouts still hiding deep in the wilderness, but carving up trees is an odd way to stay hidden. Whatever is doing this, I wish it would leave us alone, Julie said, throwing a stick into the fire. It feels targeted, like we're being tracked. A heavy silence fell over us as we considered the possibilities. Even with my friends around me, I'd never felt so exposed and vulnerable. The forest was a wall of darkness, barely held back by our small fire. As the night wore on, we kept debating the mystery in hushed voices. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and one by one, they went to sleep. Mark and I were the last ones awake. You should get some rest, I told him. I'll keep watch. He nodded gratefully and squeezed my shoulder. Thanks, man. Just a few hours. Keep that fire going. I stoked the embers as Mark headed to his tent. Now alone, the dark forest seemed to press in even closer. Every snapping twig or rustling bush made my heart pound. I kept glancing nervously at the trees, dreading the moment some creature might emerge from the shadows. When my eyelids started to droop, I piled more wood on the fire, welcoming the light and warmth that pushed back the darkness. But despite my best efforts, sleep eventually crept in. Sometime before dawn, I woke with a start. Jake was shaking my shoulder, his face pale in the dim light. Alex, look, he whispered, pointing towards the trees. My heart sank as I saw what he was pointing at. Carved into the trees surrounding our campsite were more of the bizarre symbols. They followed us, Julie said, her voice filled with fear. Mark ran a hand over his face. This can't be a coincidence. Something out there is tracking us, moving in the night. Then let's not stick around to find out what, Steve urged, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. We need to hike straight back to the cars today. No more detours. I stared at the ominous symbols, my skin crawling. I imagined unseen eyes watching us as we slept. Steve's right, I said. We should head back. It felt like admitting defeat, but we were shaken and needed to regroup. As we prepared to leave, Mark started following another trail of freshly carved symbols leading away from the camp. He turned back to us, his face determined. You guys hike out if you want, he said. But I need to see where this goes. Something strange is happening here, and I'm going to get to the bottom of it. Julie rushed to his side. Mark, please, this is dangerous. We should go back together. But I could see in his eyes that his mind was made up. Jake and Steve decided to head back with Julie, but I couldn't leave Mark alone. I'll go with Mark, I told the others, to watch his back. We'll catch up soon. They reluctantly agreed and started packing up. I saw fear and relief mixed in their expressions. Part of me wanted to go with them, but I felt a sense of loyalty to Mark. Mark gave Julie a long hug and whispered something in her ear. Then he and I took a deep breath and headed off into the trees. We hiked in silence, following the trail of disturbing symbols. Part of me still couldn't believe we were doing this instead of running back to safety, but I knew Mark wouldn't turn back, and I couldn't abandon him. We walked for nearly an hour without speaking. The symbols led us on a winding path, past massive trees dripping with moss. I had completely lost my sense of direction. Mark paused to examine another symbol carved into the bark of a spruce tree. This one looked like a skeletal hand with long, sharp fingers. Just looking at it made me uneasy. Mark traced the grooves with his fingers, his brow furrowed. These seemed to be getting more intense, he said. Or maybe ritualistic is the word. Definitely not just random vandalism. I shivered, imagining someone carving these symbols into the tree with a sharp blade. What kind of person would do this, and why? Mark pulled out his hatchet and gripped it tightly. Let's keep moving, but stay alert. No telling if whoever is doing this is still out there. I nodded, scanning the trees nervously. The shadows were deep, and anyone could be hiding in them. We continued following the symbols, the tension growing with each new one we found. They were appearing more frequently now, and they were becoming more elaborate, forming disturbing shapes and patterns. I stopped when I noticed deep scratches ringing a tree at waist height. They looked like claw marks. "Mark, look at this," I said, my voice shaking. He came over and examined the scratches. "Jesus," he whispered. "Looks like something was trying to claw right through the trunk." The fear in his voice startled me. Mark was usually fearless, always up for an adventure. But now he looked pale and shaken. "Mark, I think we should turn back," I said. "Whatever is down here doing these things, I don't think we want to find it." He stared at the tree for a moment, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, let's get the hell out of here," he rasped. "I've seen enough." We turned and started backtracking, trying to retrace our steps. I tried not to think about unseen eyes watching us from the trees. We walked for a while, but then the trail of symbols just disappeared. Where did they go?" Mark asked, panic creeping into his voice. We searched the area, but the trail was gone. It was like we'd crossed some invisible line, and the carver of the symbols didn't want us to go any further. Adrenaline surged through me as I realized we were lost. Completely lost. "Can you remember the way back?" I asked Mark, my voice trembling. He shook his head, his eyes darting around frantically. "No, it all looks the same. We must have gotten off track somewhere." I tried to stay calm, but fear was overwhelming me. We were alone, vulnerable, lost in this nightmarish forest. I pulled out my compass. At least we knew which way was south, the general direction of the camp. But who knew how far away it was, or what lay between us and safety? "We'll just keep heading south," Mark said, trying to sound positive. "As long as we don't deviate, we've got to run into something familiar sooner or later." Neither of us believed it, but we had no other choice. We gripped our gear and started trudging through the trackless woods, heading south. The trees were silent, offering no clues. Time seemed to crawl by. The sun sank lower, casting long shadows. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of leaves made us jump. As darkness fell, we knew we had to make camp. We gathered fallen branches and built a fire, the flames pushing back the encroaching darkness. We huddled close to the warmth, chewing on our remaining trail mix in silence. A bone-deep chill settled over me, and I could see the fear in Mark's eyes. Neither of us dared to voice the terrifying questions running through our minds. What was carving those symbols into the trees? Exhaustion eventually won out, and I fell into a fitful sleep, But each time I woke up, it was from the same nightmare, running through an endless maze of trees, with something monstrous chasing me. Mark's face, illuminated by the firelight, told me he was having the same nightmares. Dawn brought little comfort. We were still lost, and the woods were just as frightening in the daylight, but we forced ourselves to keep moving, heading south. We ignored our hunger, our thirst, our exhaustion. Those were minor discomforts compared to what might be waiting for us if we didn't find our way out. By late afternoon, we were on the verge of collapse. The woods seemed even thicker now, more alien. Hope was fading fast. But then, the trees ahead opened up, and we stumbled into a clearing. My heart leaped with joy. Finally, a change in the endless sea of trees. But as we entered the clearing, what we saw drained every last ounce of hope from our bodies. In the center lay the body of a large elk, its throat slit open, blood staining the ground. Strange symbols were carved into its sides. Mark looked like he was about to be sick, and I had to turn away, gagging. This was the work of whatever had been carving those symbols into the trees, and it was here. After the gruesome discovery in the clearing, Mark and I stumbled on for what felt like days. The woods were a blur, each shadowy thicket, identical to the last. The compass kept us heading south, but we could have been walking in circles for all we knew. "We've got to find water soon," Mark muttered, swatting at mosquitoes. "Can't keep this up with no supplies." I barely registered his words. My legs were leaden, my feet blistered and raw, but stopping felt even more dangerous than pressing on. As the light began to fade, we desperately searched for a place to camp, but the trees offered no respite. Finally, too exhausted to go any further, we slumped against a massive cedar tree and shared our last bit of trail mix. "Here," Mark said, holding out the nearly empty bag. "Make sure to save a handful for the morning." I took a small portion and passed it back, unable to meet his eyes. We were in survival mode now. With no chance of building a fire, we unrolled our sleeping bags beneath the cedar branches. The woods were deathly silent, and I felt completely exposed, clutching my useless little hatchet for comfort. Sleep didn't come easy, but eventually exhaustion pulled me under. I dreamt of wandering through a pitch-black maze, hearing distant screams but finding no one. I woke up with a gasp, unsure what time it was. Mark was sitting up, his hatchet resting across his lap. "My turn to keep watch," I whispered. He just nodded, his eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. I sat up, leaning against the rough bark, fighting the urge to close my eyes. Time crawled by. Adrenaline and fear kept me awake until the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees. I woke Mark up, and we forced down another meager breakfast. The endless sea of trees stretched out before us, offering no clues to our location. A sense of dread washed over me. We were going to die in this forest, I was sure of it. Then Mark grabbed my shoulder. "Alex, look," he hissed. I followed his gaze and almost stopped breathing. Carved into a tree just off to our right was a symbol we recognized. It was part of the trail that had led us into the forest. "It's a way out," Mark yelled, his face lit up with hope. We scrambled over to examine the marking and quickly found more familiar symbols leading through the trees. We followed them eagerly, like lifelines thrown to drowning sailors. By late afternoon, we were climbing a ridge, following the trail. We heard voices ahead, and our hearts leaped. Could it be? We rushed forward and were nearly tackled by Steve, Julie, and Jake. Their cries of relief and joy mingled with ours. They had been searching for us for days, and by some miracle they had found this path again. We'd nearly given up hope of finding you two, Steve said, grinning as he hugged me. Julie threw her arms around Mark. Thank God you're all right, she murmured. We've been so worried, man, Jake said, giving me a playful shake. We collapsed by their small camp, delirious with gratitude. We devoured the food they offered, taking turns recounting our separate ordeals. We never found any trail leading out, Julie said, her voice haunted. Just more of those disturbing markings. She shuddered. Mark took her hand. It's going to be okay now that we found each other. But I could see the doubt in his eyes. Steve threw a branch into the fire. I say we get up at the crack of dawn and hike straight back to the cars. No more weird detours. We're getting out of here. Enough's enough. We huddled close to the campfire, focusing on the warmth and the company, trying to forget the horrors of the past few days. But the next morning, as we packed up camp, a new sense of urgency filled the air. Let's move fast today, Mark said, his eyes serious. Stay sharp. I nodded, sliding my hatchet into my belt. We were getting out today no matter what. We set off, following the trail of symbols again, but as we hiked, I noticed that the markings were different now. They were deeper, more aggressive, almost angry. We quickened our pace, ignoring our aching muscles and hunger pangs. The rising sun lit our path, but the shadows seemed to be closing in. I was scanning the trail ahead when a sharp cry pierced the air. It came from everywhere and nowhere at once, then abruptly cut off, leaving an echoing silence. We froze, whipping our heads around. Jake, Julie yelled, but there was no answer. He had been right next to her just a moment ago, and now he was gone. Where did it come from? Which way? Steve shouted, his eyes darting around frantically. But the source of the cry was impossible to pinpoint. Mark gripped his hatchet, his knuckles white. Stay together, keep your eyes open. We huddled close, calling Jake's name, but only silence answered. Whatever lurked in this forest had snatched him away, swiftly and silently. Steve swayed, leaning against a tree for support. Oh God, this can't be real. Julie collapsed to her knees, sobbing. Mark helped her up, his own eyes filled with tears. I felt numb and helpless. Jake was gone. We had to accept that any hope of saving him had vanished just as quickly as he had. Mark turned to me, anguish etched on his face. We can't leave him out here alone, not while there's any chance. His voice broke. I grasped his shoulder, knowing we had to try something. You and Julie keep searching around here. Steve and I will hike out to get help. Julie's eyes flashed with hope. She grabbed a rope from her pack and handed it to Mark. We'll keep calling for him. I know you'll find us again. Steve stared at the shadowy trees, but he nodded. Yeah, we'll move quickly and bring back whoever we can. We clasped arms, and I gave Julie my fire starter. Light this if you get lost. We'll spot the signal. She squeezed my hand, blinking back tears. Mark drew his hatchet and handed it to me. Use this to mark your way, and be fast. I gripped the handle tightly as we embraced. Then Steve and I turned and followed the trail out, glancing back to see Mark and Julie searching for Jake. their voices echoing through the trees. Steve and I hiked as fast as we could, the rising sun casting long shadows through the trees. We used Mark's hatchet to blaze a trail, hoping to make it easier for the rescue party to find us. We had to get help, and fast. But as we hurried along, I felt a growing sense of dread. The symbols carved into the trees seemed to be getting more and more disturbing, like a twisted mockery of our escape. We pushed on, ignoring our exhaustion and hunger. We had to find help for Jake, for Julie, for Mark. By midday, we reached a rocky clearing where the trail disappeared. We searched frantically, but the symbols were gone. "This can't be happening," Steve exclaimed, his voice filled with frustration. We were lost again, but giving up wasn't an option. We picked a direction and kept moving, praying that we'd stumble upon the trail again. An icy knot of fear settled in my stomach. We were alone, vulnerable, and hunted. Late in the afternoon, we found another cluster of symbols carved into a fallen tree. We followed the trail with renewed hope, only to have it disappear again as dusk approached. Exhausted and disoriented, we made camp under a hemlock tree, the darkness pressing in around us. We didn't dare light a fire. Sleep was a distant memory. My mind was haunted by visions of Jake and the others, lost and alone in the woods. At first light, we forced down a meager breakfast and continued our desperate journey. The woods seemed even more tangled and menacing than before. But after a few miles, the trees began to thin, and sunlight streamed through the branches. A gravel path appeared ahead. We had found the road out. With renewed energy, we ran down the path until it led us to a small ranger station. I almost collapsed with relief at the sight of other human beings. The ranger's eyes widened as we told our story. He immediately radioed for backup while we guzzled water and devoured the food they offered. Before long, a search party was assembled. Rangers, search dogs, medics. We led them back into the woods, my heart pounding with every step. We reached the spot where we had last seen our friends, but there was no sign of them. Just the ashes of a cold campfire. The search dogs scoured the area, but they couldn't find any scent, no tracks, no trail. They were simply gone. A heavy dread fell over the group as we searched the surrounding woods, but there were no clues, just endless trees and shadows. Then we heard it, a distant wailing echoing through the trees. It sounded like a mournful siren, rising and falling in an unearthly rhythm. The hair on my neck prickled. Every instinct screamed at me to run. In the following days, helicopters searched from above, while police, medics, and SWAT teams combed the area. But they found nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed them whole. After a week, the search was called off. My friends were never found. It's been over 20 years since that camping trip, but I still think about it every day. The friends I lost, the evil we awakened, it haunts me. I left Alaska soon after, desperate to outrun the nightmares. But the memories haven't faded. I should have tried harder to turn back, to resist the pull of that trail. But the curiosity of youth blinded me. Steve turned to alcohol to numb the pain, but I know the shadows still haunt him. I've tried to shut it all out, to move on with my life. But at night, my dreams take me back to that forest. I hear their cries, just out of reach. The official story is that my friends got lost in the wilderness. But I know the truth. Something ancient and hungry lives in those woods, luring travelers to their doom. We awakened it, and my friends paid the price. I need to tell you this story. It's been haunting me for a decade, and I just need to get it off my chest. It's about this seriously messed up trip I took with my friends to a place called the Weeping Woods. Now, before I get into it, I gotta warn you, this story is intense. Like, seriously messed up. It might make you never want to go camping again. But if you're still with me, let's dive in. So, it all started back in college. My friends and I, Jack, Tina, Marcus, and Mui, were all obsessed with social sciences. Culture, history, myths, religion, the whole shebang. We were looking for a research project, something big and original, you know? Jack, my best friend, suggested we check out the Weeping Woods. He was from Pennsylvania, and he told us all about this creepy legend surrounding the place. Supposedly, anyone who went into the woods came out crying. According to who? I asked him. He shrugged. That's just the legend. As unlikely as it sounds, the tale took hold enough that no one from my town liked to go there. Tina, our resident folklore junkie, was immediately hooked. Come on, guys, she said. We'd get to do a road trip, go camping, and do our research all in one. And I bet no other group is going to research anything as creepy as this. Marcus, our other friend, wasn't so keen on the idea. Spooky stuff wasn't really his thing. But he saw that the rest of us were into it, so he agreed. We packed up Jack's truck with everything we'd need for a 2-week trip. Luckily, his truck was huge, so we had plenty of space for all our gear, food, and recording equipment. Jack and I took turns driving, and the trip to Pennsylvania went by pretty quickly. We mostly just talked about the legend of the Weeping Woods. Jack told us about the Woodwick Walker, this creepy figure who was said to be part of the forest. The rule is, Jack explained, his voice getting serious, don't look at his face. If you see him, don't look up. Close your eyes if you can. If you can't, stare at your feet, nothing else. Dude, you're getting all serious now, Marcus said. Jack cleared his throat. Did I? Sorry. I guess I still get a little freaked out by it, even after all these years. Have you ever been to the Weeping Woods? I asked him. Just to the edge, he admitted. This legend scared the crap out of me as a kid. I grew up in a wooded area, and I'd always imagined seeing him between the trees. If you're so scared of it, why'd you suggest it for our project? I asked, raising an eyebrow. The only way to overcome a fear is to face it, he said. Tina nodded. True enough. I have to admit, the way Jack talked about it, it started to get to me too. Even Tina was a bit more subdued after that, and Marcus was so spooked we thought he might bail on us. But we pressed on. The road twisted and turned, and eventually we reached the edge of the Weeping Woods. It was late autumn, so most of the leaves were gone, and the trees were bare. We drove through Jack's town, which was so small and isolated that it was hard to imagine any place more remote. There was only one diner in the whole town. We stopped there for breakfast, and when we told the waitress what we were up to, she got really serious. You kids promise me one thing, she said in a low voice. You keep your eyes to the ground in those woods. We laughed it off, but she didn't. As we walked back to the truck, Jack said, See, it's a whole thing out here. And you thought this was a good idea? Relax, guys, I said. It's just a legend. Yeah, Jack sighed, climbing into the truck. Get in. We're losing daylight. Just how far do we have to go? I asked. 20, maybe 30 miles, Jack said. No one actually knows how far the Weeping Woods go. The road there is kind of weird. He wasn't kidding. Even the turn onto the road was creepy. The paved highway gave way to a dirt track littered with branches and leaves. The road itself was barely there, twisting and turning in a way that made no sense. We often felt like we were going in circles. The only thing that told us we were still on the road was the line of tall, gnarled trees on either side. After a few minutes, I pointed at the compass on the dashboard. We've turned every which way, but the compass has been pointing northwest the whole time. The road leads northwest into the Weeping Woods no matter what, Jack said. That doesn't make any sense, Tina said. I told you it'd be weird, didn't I? Jack said, a hint of irritation in his voice. You good, bro? I asked, noticing his tension. Yeah, sorry, he sighed. My bad, guys. This road just gives me the creeps is all. Just then, we rounded a bend and saw a massive fallen log blocking the road. Perfect, Marcus groaned. Jack cursed under his breath. Hey, no worries, I said. We've got the tools to deal with this. I'll take care of it, Tina said, grabbing her camera. Marcus and I will take some pictures while you guys work. Maybe a video or two. Sounds good, I said, climbing out of the truck. As I stepped out of the truck, the first thing that hit me was the silence. It was this deep, heavy quiet, broken only by the wind rustling through the trees. I felt this weird urge to whisper, like I didn't want to disturb any. A thick fog had settled over the woods, making it hard to see. I walked to the back of the truck, and Jack joined. I don't mind handling this myself, you know, I said, gesturing towards the log. He shook his head. Nah, I'll help. It's all good. I nodded, but honestly, I kind of wished he'd stayed in the truck. He was acting all jumpy and nervous. We grabbed a couple of saws and headed towards the log. It was huge, and some of its branches were tangled up with other trees. What do you think? I asked. We'll saw off the big branches, then we can tow the log out of the way, he said. I nodded and got to work. The sky was getting darker, even though it was only early afternoon. The sound of our saws seemed to echo through the silent wood. It's weird how it feels like it's almost evening, I said to Jack over the noise of the saw. Yeah, that happens here, he said. Nothing unusual. Suddenly, I saw something move out of the corner of my eye. I turned around, and this pale, skinny leg vanished behind a tree. What? Jack asked. I saw something, I said, pointing towards the tree. I walked over and took a closer look. It was just a twisted tree trunk. It hadn't vanished. It was just hidden in the fog. I felt stupid. I'm an idiot, I said with a nervous laugh. It's nothing. It's hard to see in this fog. Jack kept staring at the woods. You sure? He asked, his voice tense. Yeah, bro, it's nothing, I said, getting back to work. We sawed for another 15 minutes until we could finally tow the log out of the way. We hooked up the tow cable to Jack's truck and pulled the log. One sec, Jack said, hopping out to reel in the cable. It's dark, Tina said. Too dark. I looked up. The sky was gray like it was late evening, even though it was only 1 in the afternoon. Yeah, I muttered. Jack wasn't kidding. This place is... It's not too late to turn back, Marcus pleaded. We can pick another project. No way, Tina snapped. We've put too much into this. Besides, the weirder the better, right? I recorded a bit while you guys were out there, she said, lowering her voice. I talked a little about Jack's behavior. I glared at her. Of course, she said. This little psychological breakdown of his might be the best part of the project. She wasn't wrong, but it still felt weird to be analyzing our friend behind his back. I don't like it. Marcus, you don't like any of this, Tina shot back. Jack climbed back into the truck. Finally, he said, let's get going. He put the truck in gear and we set off again. As we drove past the fallen log, I thought I saw another pale limb disappear behind a tree. This time, I ignored. The road seemed to narrow as we went deeper into the woods. The trees on either side leaned in, their branches intertwining overhead, blocking out the sky. The fog got thicker and the daylight faded even more. At least the road's staying clear, I said, trying to sound optimistic. Jack turned on the headlights. By then, I couldn't see anything beyond the nearest trees, and honestly, I was kind of relieved. It was easier to focus on the road ahead. There's a little more to the legend, Jack said after a while. We all looked at the victims of the walker, he explained. They're said to remain bound to the weeping woods, their spirits. He glanced at us in the rearview mirror. Some say they've seen those spirits trying to leave the woods, but they can't. They're trapped, unable to move on to the afterlife, Tina said, her voice hushed. Something like that, Jack replied. We didn't talk much after that. The rumble of the truck and the deepening darkness lulled us into a strange silence. It was 2:45 p.m. when we reached the end of the road. As the truck rolled into a small clearing, I gasped. Holy crap, there's a car. Jack looked over. Yeah, he said, his voice flat. I could hear Tina and Marcus shifting in the back seat, trying to get a better look. Oh God, Marcus whispered. How common is that? Not very, Tina said, her voice tight. Jack cleared his throat. There's a legend surrounding this place. We aren't the only ones who've braved the weeping woods. I peered into the car. It looked empty. Probably just someone exploring, like us, I said. Yeah, Jack agreed, but he didn't sound convinced. So, this is it then? Tina asked. Yeah, Jack said. Past that tree line, that's the weeping woods. Looks the same as the rest of these woods, I said, confused. It's not, Jack replied. Come on. He got out of the truck, and we followed. While the others unloaded the gear, I walked over to the car. It was an old Toyota, rusted and covered in grime. I couldn't see anything through the dirty windows. I wiped away some of the grime and peered inside. There wasn't anything unusual. Some junk on the floor, a travel mug, a tote bag. But then I saw a slip of paper on the dashboard. I walked around to get a better look. The paper had a message scrawled on it in all caps. Gonna look. Have to tell Lena it was a crash. I backed away from the car, a shiver running down my spine. Guys, I called out. They came over, and I showed them the note. Oh God, Marcus whispered. Have people been known to come here to, commit suicide? Tina asked Jack. Jack shook his head. Not that I know of. This person seriously did not come back, Marcus said, his voice trembling. He could have gotten lost, I offered. We all looked at Jack. He shrugged. At what point do we concede that this forest is actually dangerous? Marcus asked, throwing his hands up in the air. You're an academic, Marcus, Tina said. Do you really believe in the Woodwick Walker? I'm not saying that, he retorted. But legends come from somewhere, don't they? In this case, I'd say the reason is to justify the dangers of this cursed place. Tina frowned, then turned to me. How are you feeling about all this? More curious than scared at this point, I admitted. Sorry, Marcus, Tina said, looking at Jack. And you? I want to see this through, Jack said, his voice firm. Marcus groaned for what felt like the 100th time that day. All right, whatever, let's go. We shouldered our backpacks and headed into the weeping woods. I was half expecting some supernatural shift the moment we crossed the tree line, but it was anticlimactic. If anything was off, it was the same stuff I'd already noticed. The unnatural silence, the encroaching darkness, and the occasional pale shape disappearing into the gloom. We hiked for a while, Jack marking the trees as we went. How far? Marcus asked after about 30 minutes. However far we want, I guess, Jack answered. There's nowhere specific to go. Once you're in, Tina said. We drove all this way. Might as well make it count. No, Marcus argued. We're stopping here. He dropped his bags on the ground. Is this spot okay, Jack? I asked. Good as any, I guess, he replied. Then I'm cool with it, I said. Let's make camp. It was getting dark, so we had to use our flashlights. I set up the tents, Jack gathered firewood, Marcus started cooking, and Tina set up the recording equipment. We didn't talk much. I think we were all feeling the weight of the day and just wanted to relax. Jack managed to get a fire going, despite the damp wood. We pitched our tents in a circle around the fire pit, unfolded our chairs, and settled in. Tina finished setting up the cameras and microphones, and we finally sat down. I checked my phone. It was 4:42 p.m. I looked up and saw a faint gray light filtering through the trees. A breeze rustled the leaves. Do you have any bars? Marcus asked me. I checked my phone again. Nope. Me neither. My reception dropped one bar at a time, starting from the moment we turned onto that road, he said. I told you guys it was going to be weird, Jack mumbled. We talked quietly for a while longer, the stew simmering over the fire. Every so often one of us would glance nervously over our shoulders. The darkness seemed to be closing in faster than it should have. By the time we finished eating, it was pitch black beyond the circle of trees around our campsite. As we sat there, the wind died down. Instead of rustling leaves and creaking branches, all we could hear was this eerie sighing sound. The darkness felt alive. The shadows beyond the trees seemed to be reaching towards us, but each time they got close, the crackling of the fire would push them back. Of course, I thought I was just imagining things. At the time, anyway. That was delicious, Tina said, finishing her stew. Thanks, Marcus, I said. No problem, he replied. Well, Tina continued, it's probably too dark to film anything, and it's too early to sleep. So, I suggest we lean into the whole camping in the woods cliché and tell some ghost stories. I laughed, and so did Jack. Marcus didn't. Hell yeah, I said, clapping Marcus on the shoulder. Come on, Marcus, surely you've got a spooky story or two. So we sat around the fire, telling cheesy ghost stories. To our surprise, the scariest story came from Marcus. It was about the haunting of Little Landry, but that's a story for another time. After a couple of hours, we decided to call it a night. We were exhausted from the long drive and the hike, and we needed to be up early to explore the woods. We put out the fire and crawled into our tents. Once I was settled in my sleeping bag, I turned off my flashlight. A little light leaked in from the other tents as my friends got ready for bed, and then they turned off their lights too. I was surrounded by complete darkness. I held my hand in front of my face and couldn't see a thing. Apart from the occasional cough or shuffle from one of my friends, the only sound was the wind sighing through the trees. As creepy as it was, there was something cozy about being bundled up in my sleeping bag, surrounded by nature. Plus, I was exhausted, so I drifted off to sleep pretty quickly. But my sleep was far from peaceful. I tossed and turned, plagued by nightmares I couldn't quite remember. It was like I knew what they were about, but the details were just out of reach. All I knew was that they were dark and disturbing. Then I woke up to the sound of creaking wood. It sent chills down my spine. I know, we were in a forest, so of course there would be creaking wood, but this was different. This creaking was slow, deliberate, with whispers hidden within it. It felt alive. I sat up in my tent, straining to hear where the sound was coming from, but it was like it was coming from everywhere at once. There was no wind anymore, just the creaking. I wondered if my friends were awake too. Would they believe me if I told them about the sound? I thought about calling out to them, but I was too scared. Images flashed through my mind, my imagination conjuring up terrifying figures to match the creepy sounds. And then I heard it. Jack's voice, barely a whisper. "He's here. Stay in your tents. Don't look at him." The way he said it sent ice through my veins. I froze, holding my breath and squeezing my eyes shut. The creaking got closer. I heard someone shuffling in one of the other tents, and it made me angry. Who the hell was making noise? The whispering within the creaking got louder, and I could almost make out words. Then a blinding light flashed on, so bright I could see it through my eyelids. Instinctively, I opened my eyes and looked up. Through the mesh of my tent, I saw Jack standing there holding a flashlight. His face was pale, and his breathing was ragged. "Jack," I whispered, "what are you doing?" He raised a hand towards my tent. "Quiet. Close your eyes and be quiet. I'm fine." But his voice told me I had to obey. I closed my eyes again and held my breath. The creaking got even closer. It sounded like it was right outside my tent. I could hear Jack's panicked breathing. I wasn't religious, but I almost started praying. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the creaking stopped. A breeze swept through the campsite, and the oppressive presence was gone. I opened my eyes. Jack was gone too. I scrambled out of my tent. "Jack," I called out. Tina was doing the same. "He's gone," she whispered. Marcus emerged from his tent, his face pale. "Jack!" I yelled, my voice echoing through the trees. There was no answer. I picked up his flashlight and swung it around, searching the darkness. Nothing. I pointed the flashlight at the ground where it had been lying. There was a clear impression in the dirt, but there were no footprints leading away. Tina started laughing. "Oh, this is great. This is absolutely fantastic." "What are you talking about?" I asked, scowling at her. "It's a prank, of course. Jack's messing with us," she said, shaking her head. I tried to think clearly, despite my racing heart. After a moment, I nodded. "I guess that's the most logical explanation." "Are you kidding me?" Marcus whispered. "You both heard the wood, didn't you?" "Yeah, but we're in a forest," I said. "A creepy forest," Tina added. "I bet Jack's got the whole thing recorded. We'll never live this down." "We'll look at the footage," I said to Marcus. That'll calm your nerves, won't it? He nodded. Tina grabbed the camera that was pointed at our campsite. I built up the fire again while she reviewed the footage. I glanced at my phone. It was 12:15 a.m. "Ha!" Tina exclaimed. "Told you so." She crouched down between Marcus and me and hit play. We saw a grainy image of our tents, lit only by Jack's flashlight. He was looking around, and for a second I thought I saw some pale figures in the background, but I dismissed it. The image was too blurry. "Is there audio?" I asked. "Should be," Tina answered. "But why isn't there any sound?" She shrugged. "We must have been imagining things." We watched as Jack suddenly froze, his flashlight pointed at something we couldn't see. Maybe it was off camera, or maybe he was just messing with us. He set the flashlight down and walked towards whatever he was looking at. "You see," Tina said, pausing the video. "That bastard pranked us." She stood up and put the camera back on its strap. "Jack, come out already. The prank's done, you win." She called out a few more times, and I even joined in, but there was no answer. "You still think this is a prank?" Marcus asked, his voice trembling. I looked at him, unsure. "Yes," Tina said firmly. "Then where the hell is Jack?" Marcus asked. Tina looked away. I sighed and stood up. "Look, whatever this is, we have to find him. We're in the middle of nowhere, and even if this is a prank, we can't risk him getting lost or hurt." "Oh, come on," Marcus groaned. "It's fair," Tina agreed. "It's freezing. Let's bundle up, grab some lights, and head out. I'll keep the camera rolling." "I'll grab a knife," Marcus said. Tina and I exchanged uneasy glances. "To mark the trees," he explained, rolling his eyes, "so we can find our way back." "Ah, smart," I said. A few minutes later we set out into the forest following the direction Jack had gone. We called out his name, but our voices grew less hopeful with each repetition. Our flashlights were useless against the thick darkness. Fear and frustration welled up inside me as I searched through the trees. "Jack! Jack! I've marked 15 trees, guys," Marcus said. "We should really turn back." "Okay," I sighed. "We'll head back and try a different direction." As we turned around, there was a sharp crack. Tina screamed. What is it?" I asked, rushing over to her. She was staring at the ground, one hand on her chest. Oh, God. "Come look," she whispered. Marcus and I hurried over. There was a broken bone lying in Tina's footprint. "It's human," she whispered. "What?" I said, startled. "How do you know?" "Because I studied this in a recent course," she hissed. "That is without a doubt a human femur." I grimaced and brushed away the leaves and dirt, revealing more of the skeleton. "You don't think?" Marcus started, his voice trailing off. "No," I said, shaking my head. "Definitely not. These bones are old." "Maybe it's the guy from the car," Tina suggested. "Maybe," I murmured, uncovering more of the skeleton. By the time I was done, we were looking at a full human skeleton. The hands were folded over the rib cage, and clutched in the bones of one hand was a bundle of sticks. "Jesus Christ," Tina muttered, still recording. "Let's hurry back," I said, a wave of dread washing over me. Marcus led the way, following his markings on the trees. We were all spooked now, even Tina. When we got back to camp, Marcus immediately started a new fire. Tina paced back and forth, lost in thought. I was restless. "We need to head out again," I said. "Jack's still out there." Marcus and Tina looked at me. "Where would we even look?" Tina asked. "I don't know," I said. "Anywhere. Just pick a direction." I pointed my flashlight in the opposite direction from where Jack had disappeared. As I shone the light through the trees, I gasped. I saw a pair of legs sticking out from behind a tree trunk. I recognized Jack's pants. My heart pounding, I ran towards him. I rounded the tree and found him alive. But something was wrong. He was sitting on the ground, his eyes staring blankly ahead, his arms folded over his chest. In his hands was a bundle of sticks. "Jack!" I cried, kneeling beside him. He didn't respond. He didn't even move. "Tina!" I yelled. "Are you all right? What's wrong with him?" "This must be part of the prank," Tina muttered, her voice shaky. I glared at her. "Are you serious?" She looked confused. I don't know. "We have to get out of here," Marcus said, his voice trembling. "But the project," Tina started. "Look," I interrupted, "we'll come back for the equipment, but right now we need to get Jack some help." "How do we get him back to the truck?" Marcus asked. Jack was a big guy. There was no way we could carry him. "Let's get him up and see if he'll walk," I said. We pulled him to his feet, and the bundle of sticks fell to the ground. He was limp, his legs dragging. "Enough already," Tina shouted, her voice desperate. "The joke's over, damn it." "All right, Marcus," I said. "We'll each take an arm and drag him. Tina, you guide us. Take Jack's flashlight and look for his markings. We need to get to the truck." She did as I asked, but she didn't say a word. She even set down her camera. We set off, dragging Jack through the woods. His legs left deep grooves in the dirt. We were facing away from Tina, so we had to navigate in the dark. The darkness felt like it was closing in on us, seeping into our skin. It was a horrible feeling. The sighing of the wind seemed louder now. I wondered what time it was, probably 1 or 2 in the morning. A few hours until dawn. Then Marcus screamed. I looked over and saw it. A tall, thin figure with unnaturally long limbs and ropey flesh. It was standing just close enough that I could see it clearly in the dim light. The creature's twisted mouth opened in a silent sigh, and it reached out a long, bony arm towards Marcus and me. We both screamed and started running towards Tina's flashlight. "What happened?" she gasped, shining the light in our eyes. "There's something out there," Marcus shrieked. "Run!" Was it the Woodwick Walker? I wasn't sure. But we had both looked at it and were still okay, so maybe it wasn't. As we ran through the woods, I kept glancing back, expecting to see the creature chasing us. But instead, the wind suddenly stopped. The rustling leaves and creaking branches fell silent. We froze. I felt a chill run down my spine. Marcus and I exchanged terrified glances. Then we heard it. Creaking wood. My heart pounded as the creaking grew louder. "Don't look at him," I whispered to my friends. Marcus squeezed his eyes shut. I looked down at Jack. He was still staring blankly upwards. I clapped my hands over his eyes, then closed my own and held my breath. The whispering and the creaking grew louder. I strained to make out the words, but I couldn't. Then Tina spoke, and my stomach dropped. "Oh, this is ridiculous," she yelled. "I'm not playing this stupid game anymore." "Tina, quiet," I hissed. She laughed. Look at you two with your eyes closed. You're grown men. Give me a break. There's nothing. She stopped. There's nothing. Her voice trailed off, but her breathing quickened. I heard a thud, and through my closed eyelids I saw the light shift. She had dropped the flashlight. A few agonizing moments passed, and then the creaking stopped. When I opened my eyes, Tina was gone. It's over, Marcus, I said quietly. He opened his eyes, tears streaming down his face. We need to leave this place, he rasped. Let's get Jack back to the truck, I said. Then I'll come back and find Tina. Marcus nodded. We started dragging Jack again, stopping every few feet to check our direction. The woods were still pitch black, and I hadn't forgotten about the pale creature. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, but we finally made it back to the truck. Oh, thank God, Marcus moaned. Thank God. We shoved Jack into the back seat, and I turned back towards the weeping woods. I'm sorry, Marcus said. I'm not going back. I know, I said. Stay here and watch over Jack. If he gets worse, leave without us. Get him to a hospital. Otherwise, give me a few hours. I'll find Tina and get back. As I stepped back into the woods, I was amazed at my own courage. I guess when you're faced with either facing something terrifying or letting your friends die, the choice becomes easy. But God, I hated it. I felt like I was losing pieces of myself with every step I took back into that awful place. I kept seeing pale limbs at the edge of my vision, and I couldn't tell if they were just branches or actual monsters. But it didn't matter anymore. I was going in, no matter what. I figured I'd find Tina lying somewhere like Jack had been. I remembered that we found Jack right by the spot where he'd vanished, so I retraced our steps hoping to find Tina. I walked all the way back to our campsite without seeing her. Then I turned around and tried again. It was on the way back that I saw her legs sticking out from behind a tree. I ran over, calling out her name. She was lying there, just like Jack, her eyes blank, her hands folded over her chest, clutching a bundle of sticks. I knew it was useless, but I still tried to wake her up. Tina, Tina, please say something. Can you hear me? She didn't respond, didn't even move. I angrily snatched the sticks from her hand. We're getting out of here, I whispered, lifting her into my arms. Dawn had finally broken, so I left the flashlight behind. As I struggled back towards the truck, the pale creatures were all around me, sighing and reaching for me with their long, bony fingers. I ignored them and kept going. Better this than the walker itself, I thought. And just as the thought crossed my mind, the sighing stopped. The woods fell completely silent. Then I heard it, creaking wood. My heart pounded as the creaking grew louder. This was the third time I'd faced it that night, but the first time alone. And this was the moment that truly broke me. The moment that has haunted me ever since. I fell to my knees, gently laying Tina on the ground. I covered her eyes with my hand. In that moment of terror, I couldn't bring myself to close my own eyes. It felt too vulnerable. So as the creaking got louder, I tilted my head down and stared at the ground. Something deep inside me urged me to look up, to see what was approaching. But I resisted. The whispering and creaking were angry this time, full of hate. I could feel it, even though I still couldn't make out the words. I didn't look, even when I could sense it right next to me, its breath on my neck. I didn't look as it circled me. I saw one of its legs come into view. It was a limb of both wood and flesh, twisted and broken, oozing sap and blood. The temptation to look up at its face was almost unbearable, but I resisted. The creature started making this new sound deep in its throat. It was a wet, guttural croaking, a sound that no human should ever hear. I kept my eyes down as it circled me, breathing on me, croaking at me. Seconds felt like hours. And then, finally, it went away. The croaking turned back to angry whispering, and the whispering faded into the creaking of the wood as the walker retreated. When it was finally silent, I picked Tina up and started walking towards the truck. We made it back to the clearing, and Marcus just stared at me in horror as I put Tina in the back seat with Jack. I got in the driver's seat and got the hell out of there. Marcus and I didn't speak a word the whole way to the nearest hospital. The doctors ran all sorts of tests, but they couldn't find anything wrong with Jack and Tina. They said they were in a catatonic state, that they might snap out of it one day, or they might not. To this day, Jack and Tina are in a special care facility. They're still the same, eyes blank, bodies limp. They'd probably be if it wasn't for one thing. They show a strange interest in sticks and branches. They don't respond to anything else, but if there's a stick nearby, they'll reach for it and clutch it to their chest. As for Marcus and me, well, we never spoke again. I tried to reach out to him a few times, but he ghosted me. I can't say I blame him. What we went through was life-altering. I finished my degree, but I lost my passion for social sciences. I settled for an average job in a town far away from any forest. I even cut down all the trees and bushes around my house. But even now, in my safe little house, far from any woods, I still hear it sometimes. The creaking of wood. I never gave them much thought. Skinwalkers, Wendigo, spirits, just stories. Then I moved to the reservation. I was assigned to work as a park ranger in a remote stretch of land near the Navajo Nation, a place where the mountains are jagged and the land feels as ancient as time itself. It was my first real job in the field after training, and I thought I could handle whatever nature could throw at me. But I was wrong. It all started the way these things usually do, with a quiet warning. I was in the ranger station when I first met Tom, an old Navajo man who lived near the edge of the reservation. He was the type of person who spoke rarely, but when he did, everyone listened. I'd seen him around, his weathered face always serious, eyes sharp, like he saw things no one else did. He never offered a greeting, just a nod. One afternoon he came into the station, looked at me with those piercing eyes, and said something that still chills me to my core. "They're worse than skinwalkers, Ranger." At first I thought he was talking about some new threat to the wildlife, perhaps a predator spotted near the park. But there was a weight in his voice, something that made me pause. He had always seemed so calm, yet now he was on edge, visibly uncomfortable. "You talking about a pack of wolves, or something else?" I asked, trying to keep the conversation light. Tom didn't answer me right away. Instead, he stared out the window, his brow furrowing as though he were thinking of something long buried. Then he spoke again. "You need to be careful out there. The land is ancient, and there are things in those woods. Things older than the people who walk here now. Things worse than skinwalkers. He leaned in closer, lowering his voice. Those things can wear the skin of animals, but what I'm talking about, they wear the skin of us. I thought the old man was losing his mind. I laughed it off to myself, deciding it was just one of those superstitions passed down through generations. But something about the way he said it unsettled me. There was a warning in his voice I couldn't ignore. A week later, I'd wish I had. The park I patrolled was far from any city, surrounded by thick forests and steep cliffs. The locals rarely visited unless they had business on the reservation, which made it a peaceful, isolated place, just how I liked it. But one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the forest began to settle into darkness, I found myself drawn deeper into the woods than I intended. I was on a routine patrol, checking for illegal hunting traps, when I stumbled upon something strange. The forest had fallen unnervingly silent. The usual hum of insects and chirping of birds had vanished. In its place, there was a heavy, suffocating stillness. My flashlight flickered as I walked, casting long shadows across the trees. Then I saw it. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light. A figure, tall and hunched, moving through the trees with unnerving speed. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a person. But the shape was wrong. Too long, too thin, too unnatural. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck rising. I wasn't sure why, but I knew, deep down, that whatever I was seeing wasn't a creature of this world. I tried to call out, but my voice caught in my throat. Something about the figure, its movement, its stillness, made me want to stay quiet, as if by speaking I would draw its attention. I turned and started walking back, slowly, trying to keep my footsteps light, my breath shallow. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, stalked from just beyond the trees. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The image of the creature haunted me. Its dark, glimmering eyes, its hollow, human-like limbs. I had seen things in the wild, but this felt different. The weight of Tom's warning, the way he'd spoken of things that wore human skin, gnawed at me like a persistent itch. The next day I went to Tom, hoping for answers. I didn't believe in ghosts or spirits, but something had happened that I couldn't explain. When I found him, he was sitting on his porch, staring out at the vast, empty land. His face was grave. I sat down beside him without saying a word. He knew why I was there. "You saw it, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low and calm. I nodded. "The one you saw last night," he said, his eyes not leaving the horizon. "That wasn't a skinwalker. That was worse, much worse." I swallowed. "What are they, then?" "They are the ones who were here before us. They are the ones who have always been here. Skinwalkers are just a story. They are a small thing compared to what lies in the heart of these woods. These creatures, these things, they are not flesh and bone. They're older than any curse. They were the ones who made the land what it is, and they've never left." He paused, glancing at me, his eyes narrowing. "They wear the skin of humans, not animals. And they can walk like us, talk like us. They can even be us if they want. You'll never know who's one of them until it's too late." That night I went back to the woods. I wasn't sure why, but something inside me told me I had to. I had to see the truth. I wasn't going to find answers if I stayed in the ranger station. hiding behind my reports and patrols. The forest was darker than I remembered. The air felt thicker, the shadows deeper, and then I saw it again, the same figure moving between the trees. Only this time, I wasn't alone. I could hear it whispering, words in a language I couldn't understand, but somehow I felt it in my bones. It wasn't just calling to me, it was calling to the earth itself. I stepped forward, the ground beneath me shifting unnaturally, pulling me deeper into the forest. I wanted to scream, but my throat constricted. I wanted to run, but my legs refused. The thing in the woods wasn't a skinwalker. It was something far older, and now that it had seen me, I knew it would never let me leave. When I woke up, I was back at the ranger station. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the land. I had no memory of how I'd gotten there or how long I'd been gone, but I knew one thing for certain. Tom was right. They are worse than skinwalkers, and they are waiting. If you hear their whispers, if you see their shadows flicker at the corner of your eye, don't follow. Don't even look. Because once they know you're listening, once they know you see them, you're already lost. I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was becoming undeniable. I tried to convince myself that it was all just exhaustion, a trick of the mind brought on by too many nights alone in the woods. But deep down I knew better. I tried to return to some sense of normalcy, continuing my patrols and paperwork, but the unease gnawed at me like a constant itch I couldn't scratch. I couldn't stop thinking about that night, about the way the creature moved, about the whispers that filled the air like a distant chant. Every time I closed my eyes, I could still hear the rustling in the trees, the unsettling silence that had swallowed everything in its way. Then it happened again. This time I wasn't alone. I had invited one of the newer rangers, Sarah, to join me for a night patrol. She was bright, eager, and hadn't been jaded by the long hours in the field like I had. I figured a fresh pair of eyes would keep me from spiraling, keep me grounded. As we hiked deeper into the forest, the familiar tension settled over me, the air growing thick with something unnameable. Sarah didn't seem to notice, happily chatting away about her training and the wildlife we'd been monitoring. I was barely listening, my eyes scanning the woods for something, anything, that might confirm what I already knew. Then we saw it. At first it was just a flicker, a shadow darting between the trees. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. I turned to Sarah. "Did you see that?" I asked, my voice suddenly low. She paused, looking around. "What? The deer?" I shook my head. "No, something else, something bigger." I started moving toward the trees, instinctively drawn to the spot where I'd seen the movement. Sarah followed hesitantly, sensing my change in demeanor. As we moved deeper, I felt it again, the oppressive stillness that always seemed to precede them. I could feel their eyes, just out of sight, watching us, waiting, and I knew that whatever it wasn't just a creature. It was something that knew we were there, something that had been waiting for us to wander too far. And then the whispers came. It wasn't a sound I could hear directly, but I could feel it in the air, like an electric charge skimming my skin. It was soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in the wind, but then it grew louder, sharper. It wasn't words, I couldn't make out anything distinct, but it was a voice, a collective voice, resonating from the forest itself. "Get out," it seemed to say. My legs froze. "Get out," the voice repeated, louder now, clearer. It was coming from everywhere, from above, below. The very ground beneath us seemed to pulse with it. Sarah, visibly shaken, started backing away. "Nate, what the hell is that?" she whispered, her breath coming in, quick, sharp gasps. "Move," I hissed, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward the path. My eyes darted around the woods, scanning for movement. But the shadows were gone. The silence had returned, suffocating and heavy. But it wasn't over. We hadn't made it 10 feet before I saw it, a figure standing between the trees, just off the trail. It was tall, too tall, impossibly tall. And it was just standing there, motionless, watching us. I couldn't make out any distinct features, only a shape, dark and distorted, shifting unnaturally in the pale moonlight. "Run!" I shouted before I even realized the words were out of my mouth. I grabbed Sarah's hand, pulling her harder, faster, but every step I took felt like the ground was sinking beneath me. The trees seemed to close in, the path twisting, turning in directions that didn't make sense. We were lost. I knew it, even as the trees seemed to move around us. I could feel the weight of the thing behind us, just beyond the edge of my sight, drawing closer. The whispers were getting louder now, accompanied by a low growl, like something was shifting in the depths of the woods, something massive, ancient, and angry. We finally stumbled back onto the main trail, but it wasn't the same trail we had taken. The trees were different now. Tighter, denser, darker. The forest felt alive. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was watching us. Every footstep echoed too loudly, every breath felt too shallow. I felt like I was suffocating, like the forest itself was closing in, wrapping its fingers around my throat. "Don't look back," I whispered. But it was too late. We both turned, and there it was, the figure from before, standing in the shadows between the trees. No longer just watching, it was moving now, gliding forward, its form shifting in unnatural angles, its limbs too long, too thin, like the branches of a tree twisting in the wind. But this thing didn't belong in the forest. It wasn't part of the land. It was the land. And it was coming for us. I don't remember how we made it back to the station. My mind was a blur, everything happening too fast and too slow, all at once. I remember Sarah's terrified face, her hands trembling as she clutched my jacket, but nothing else. When we got back, we found ourselves alone. The station was eerily quiet, as if it had been waiting for us. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat by the window, staring out at the darkened woods, knowing that I would never be able to escape the memories of what I had seen, what I had felt. And that's when I heard it again, the whispers just outside the window. They were softer now, almost seductive. But I knew better. The things in the woods weren't interested in conversation. They had no interest in peace. They were only interested in one thing, us. And I was certain, deep in my bones, that the forest would never let us leave, not unless it had already taken everything from us first. I don't know what happens next. I'm telling you this now because I don't have much time left. The forest is always watching, always waiting. I can feel it creeping closer, pushing in from the edges of my world. But I know one thing for sure. Once it has you, you don't leave. Not really. So if you ever find yourself near the edge of a forest, and you hear something rustling in the trees, or if you feel the ground shift beneath your feet, remember this. There are things in the woods, and they are not skinwalkers. They are much, much worse. As the days passed, I began to lose track of time. The whispers became more frequent, more insistent, until they weren't just confined to the trees. It felt like they were inside my head, inside my very bones, crawling under my skin, making my thoughts disjointed. I started to forget what was real and what wasn't. I told myself I was going crazy. I had to be. This couldn't be real. Not in any rational sense. But deep down, I knew the truth. I had seen it. I had felt it. The creatures in the woods, those shadowy, ancient things, they were real. They were as old as the land itself, and they were getting closer. The station, once a place of comfort, had become a prison. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, every rustling branch, each one seemed to be them, waiting for me to slip, waiting for me to break. And then the night came, the night I had been dreading. I had just finished my patrol, walking back to the station, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate. They echoed in the empty night air. My heart began to race. I turned around. Nothing. But I could feel it. The thing. It was there, in the shadows, just out of sight. Watching, waiting. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran. The woods were alive, shifting with every step I took. The trees seemed to close in, narrowing the path, bending unnaturally toward me as if they were reaching for me. I stumbled through the underbrush, tripping over roots and rocks, but I couldn't stop. I reached the clearing, the spot where I'd seen it before, the creature, the figure that wasn't supposed to exist. I could feel it watching me again, its presence suffocating, like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for the final moment. I looked up, and there it was. The shadow stretched impossibly tall against the backdrop of the moonlit sky, its limbs twisted and cracked like old wood. Its eyes, dark, infinite, were fixed on me, and for a moment I thought I saw a flicker of recognition, and then it spoke. "We were here before you." The words weren't in any language I knew, but I understood them, felt them deep inside, like a memory long forgotten. Suddenly, the earth beneath my feet began to give way. The ground was no longer solid. It was soft, like wet clay, shifting beneath my weight. I reached out to grab a tree for support, but the bark crumbled in my hands, and the tree fell backward, disappearing into the darkness. I was sinking. Panic clawed at my chest as I tried to pull myself free. But the more I struggled, the faster the ground seemed to pull me in. And I realized then the forest wasn't just alive. It was a living thing, a vast, hungry entity that consumed everything in its path. I heard the whispering again, louder now, almost deafening. It was all around me, inside me. "You can never leave." I screamed, the sound swallowed by the forest as I was pulled under. When they found me, hours later, I was still alive. But I wasn't the same. The forest had changed me. The land had marked me with its presence, filled me with its endless hunger. My body was intact, but my mind was elsewhere. I had seen things, felt things, things I can never unsee. The woods had taken something from me, something I could never get back. I still remember the last time I heard the final bell ring at Riverside High. It was a Friday in late May, unseasonably cold for a Colorado spring. The sound echoed through empty hallways where student artwork still hung, waiting to be taken down for summer break. I stood in my classroom, room 237, surrounded by the familiar smell of chalk dust and old books, knowing it would be the last time I'd ever grade papers at my desk or write tomorrow's lesson on the whiteboard. 12 years of teaching gone in an instant, all because of what happened with Jeremy. The official report said he was troubled, that no one could have seen it coming. But I did see it. I saw the way his essays grew darker, how his normally precise handwriting became erratic. I noticed when he stopped raising his hand in class discussions about The Catcher in the Rye, his favorite book just months before. I reported everything to the administration, filed all the proper paperwork, followed every protocol. They said I did everything right. They said it wasn't my fault, but they still asked for my resignation. The whispers started almost immediately. In small towns like ours, news travels fast, and rumors travel faster. Parents who used to greet me warmly at the grocery store now hurried their children to different aisles. Former colleagues crossed the street to avoid talking to me. Even my closest friends started making excuses to cancel our weekly coffee dates. I lasted 3 months in that suffocating atmosphere before putting my house on the market. The real estate agent advised me to price it low for a quick sale. Given the circumstances, she said, not meeting my eyes. I took whatever I could get and moved into a small apartment in Denver, thinking the anonymity of the city might help. It didn't. The nightmares followed me. In them, I was always back in my classroom, but something was wrong. The desks would be arranged in perfect rows, but all facing the wrong way. The whiteboard would be covered in writing that looked like mine, but said things I would never write. And Jeremy, he was always there, sitting in the back row, staring at me with eyes that weren't quite human anymore. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, reaching for my phone to check the news, terrified I'd see his name again. But of course, I never did. You can't die twice after all. During the day, I tried to keep busy. I picked up substitute teaching jobs at various schools around Denver, but word always seemed to get around eventually. The assignments would slowly dry up, and I'd have to find new schools, further and further from my apartment. That's how I found myself scrolling through job listings at 3 a.m. on a Tuesday, desperate for something, anything that would let me start over. The advertisement caught my eye immediately. Caretaker wanted. Remote mountain location. Seeking solitary individual for winter caretaking duties at private property in Colorado Rockies. Minimal human contact required. Must be comfortable with isolation and strictly following guidelines. Housing provided. Generous compensation. Background check required. No phone calls. There was an email address listed, nothing else. I stared at it for a long time, the blue light of my laptop screen burning my tired eyes. It seemed too perfect, almost suspiciously so, but what did I have to lose? I crafted my email carefully, being upfront about my past, but emphasizing my attention to detail and ability to follow rules. I didn't expect a response, but one came less than an hour later. Miss Mason, your candor is appreciated. Your situation interests us. Attached, please find preliminary paperwork and detailed job description. If still interested after review, further instructions will follow. Property management. The attachments were extensive. Liability waivers, non-disclosure agreements, detailed maps showing the property's location deep in the Rockies. The job description was oddly specific about some things: exact times for property checks, precise temperature settings for different rooms, and strangely vague about others, with references to special maintenance procedures and unique property features. I signed everything that night. The following weeks passed in a blur of preparations. I sold most of my furniture, put the rest in storage, and gave notice at my apartment. My neighbors seemed relieved to see me go. Mrs. Martinez from next door, who used to bring me homemade tamales, wouldn't even look at me as I carried out my last boxes. The morning I left, Denver was just waking up. The sun hadn't fully risen, casting long shadows between the buildings as I loaded my old Honda Civic with what remained of my life. The car protested when I turned the key, as if warning me about what lay ahead. But I had to go. I had to escape. The drive into the mountains was longer than expected. My phone lost signal about 2 hours in, right where the paved road gave way to gravel. The GPS had already started glitching, showing me driving through empty space, so I switched to the printed directions I'd been provided. Turn left at the lightning-struck pine marked with red ribbon. Follow the path until you see 3 rocks stacked like a cairn at the fork. Take the right path. Do not take the left. Continue until you see the cabin. Simple enough, but something about the capitalized warning made my stomach twist. I followed the directions carefully, checking and double-checking each landmark. The forest grew denser as I climbed higher, the trees pressing closer to the road until their branches scraped against my car's roof. It was late afternoon by the time I spotted the cabin. The setting sun cast long shadows through the pine forest, making the building look almost sinister. It matched the photo I'd been sent: an aging wooden structure with peeling paint and a slightly sagging roof. Thick vines crept up its sides like grasping fingers, and the windows were partially obscured by dirt and cobwebs. As I pulled up, I noticed something odd about the shadows around the cabin. They seemed to move wrong, flowing against the wind rather than with it. I blamed it on fatigue from the drive. The porch creaked ominously under my feet as I approached the front door. The key was exactly where they said it would be, tucked under a loose board that shifted too easily, as if it had been moved many times before. As I bent to retrieve it, I felt a distinct sensation of being watched. I scanned the tree line but saw nothing except the endless forest stretching in every direction. The key turned smoothly in the lock, but the door resisted opening, as if something on the other side was pushing back. When it finally swung inward, the smell hit me immediately, musty and thick, like old books and damp wood, with an underlying metallic tang that made my nose wrinkle. The interior was surprisingly spacious, filled with heavy furniture that looked like it had been there for generations. Dark wood dominated everything: the floors, the walls, the massive bookshelf that took up one entire wall of the living room. Faded photographs in tarnished frames lined the hallway, showing various people standing in front of the cabin. Something about their faces seemed wrong, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what. On the kitchen counter, I found an envelope with my name written in precise, almost mechanical handwriting. Inside was a note that would change everything. Welcome to your new position, Miss Mason. Basic supplies are stocked in the pantry. Monthly deliveries will arrive on the first Tuesday of each month. Do not attempt to interact with the delivery person. They have been instructed not to engage. Your primary duties are maintenance and upkeep of the property. A detailed list of tasks can be found in the maintenance manual in the kitchen drawer. Do not deviate from the prescribed schedules. Important. Before beginning your duties, you must read the rules located in the basement. The basement key is attached to this note. Do not delay in reading these rules. Your safety depends on strict adherence to them. Welcome to the family. Management. I fingered the small brass key attached to the note. Something about the way family was written made my skin crawl. The letters seemed slightly darker than the rest, as if whoever wrote it had pressed harder on those words. The sun was setting now, casting an orange glow through the grimy windows that made the dust motes dance like embers. I decided to bring in my belongings before it got dark. Each trip to the car felt longer than the last, and the shadows between the trees seemed to grow denser with every passing minute. Inside, I began exploring my new home. The cabin was bigger than it appeared from outside. 2 bedrooms, a spacious living room with a stone fireplace, and a surprisingly modern kitchen. The bathroom had clearly been renovated recently, with new fixtures that looked almost out of place among the cabin's otherwise antiquated features. But something felt off about the layout. The rooms didn't quite seem to match up with the cabin's exterior dimensions. Hallways appeared slightly longer from one direction than they did from the other, and there was the constant feeling that spaces shifted when they weren't being directly observed. I was unpacking dishes in the kitchen when I first heard it, a soft humming coming from somewhere in the walls. The sound was almost musical, rising and falling in a pattern that seemed just on the edge of familiar, but when I pressed my ear to the wall, it stopped completely. That's when I remembered the rules in the basement. The temperature seemed to drop several degrees as I approached the basement door. It was a heavy thing, made of dark wood with black iron hinges that looked ancient. The key fit perfectly, but turning it felt wrong somehow, like I was unlocking something that was meant to stay sealed. The door resisted opening, groaning on its hinges as if it hadn't been opened in years, though I could have sworn I heard movement behind it just moments before. A set of steep stairs descended into darkness, disappearing into shadows that seemed too deep, too solid. I fumbled for a light switch and found one, but the bulb that flickered to life was weak, casting more shadows than light. The air that drifted up from below was cold and damp, carrying that same metallic scent I'd noticed earlier, only stronger now. Each step creaked under my weight as I descended, the sound echoing in ways that didn't quite make sense. About halfway down, I noticed the writing on the walls, spidery black letters that seemed to shift and move in my peripheral vision. My heart began to pound as I read them. Rules for the caretaker. 1. Always close every door behind you, especially the basement door. What comes up must go back down. 2. Before sleeping, knock 3 times on the bedroom wall. This keeps the peace. If you forget, you may hear knocking from the other side. Do not answer it. 3. If you hear music from outside, do not look out the windows. It isn't meant for your eyes. 4. Turn on the lights in every room you enter at night. Darkness breeds darkness. 5. Leave a light on in the living room overnight. If you wake up to darkness, something has entered the cabin. Do not try to restore the light. 6. Do not leave the cabin for any reason between 11:00 p.m. and 5:00 a.m. They are hungry then. 7. Under no circumstances should you read the guest ledger in the living room. Some knowledge comes at too high a price. Below the rules, in different handwriting that looked rushed and shaky, someone had added, "They're watching. They're always watching, even now." I stood there for what felt like hours, reading and rereading the rules. Part of me wanted to laugh. This had to be some kind of elaborate joke, right? But something about the desperate way the final message was written made it impossible to dismiss entirely. That first night was the hardest. Every creak of the old house made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hold movement. I followed the rules meticulously, closing each door firmly behind me, checking and double-checking the living room light. When it came time for bed, I felt ridiculous knocking 3 times on the bedroom wall, but I did it anyway. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling, or at least I told myself it was settling. The alternative, that the footsteps I heard in the hallway or the whispers that seemed to come from the walls were something else entirely, was too terrifying to consider. Around midnight, a strange calm settled over me. The isolation that had seemed so oppressive earlier now felt almost protective. I drifted off to sleep, thinking about Jeremy, wondering if he ever felt the same sense of peace before the end. I woke to sunlight streaming through my window, and for a moment everything felt normal. Then I noticed the 3 perfect circles scratched into the wall where I'd knocked the night before. The scratches in the wall were just the beginning. That first week I tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, establishing a routine that might help me ignore the increasingly strange occurrences around me. During daylight hours, I focused on my caretaking duties, cleaning, checking the generator, ensuring the pipes hadn't frozen as winter approached. But each day brought new oddities that became harder to rationalize away. On Tuesday morning, I found all my coffee mugs had been rearranged in the cabinet, placed upside down in a perfect spiral pattern. When I mentioned this in my daily log, another requirement of the job, I noticed my previous day's entry had changed. The words were the same, but the handwriting slowly morphed across the page, starting as mine and ending in an elaborate script I didn't recognize. Wednesday, I spent hours cleaning the living room windows, trying to let in more light. But no matter how much I scrubbed, the glass remained cloudy, as if something on the outside was pressing against it. At one point I could have sworn I saw handprints appearing on the other side of the glass, small ones, like a child's. But when I went outside to check, there were no marks and no footprints in the mud beneath the window. That night, I forgot to knock on the bedroom wall before falling asleep. The knocking woke me at exactly 3:33 a.m., 3 sharp raps that seemed to come from inside the wall itself. I lay there frozen as 3 more knocks came, then 3 more, each set louder than the last. The wall began to bulge slightly with each knock, the wallpaper rippling like water. Finally, gathering what little courage I had, I reached out and knocked 3 times in response. The sound stopped immediately, replaced by what sounded like a child giggling. When I checked the wall in the morning, the wallpaper was pristine, showing no signs of the previous night's disturbance. But it was the music that truly tested my resolve. I was washing dishes on Friday evening, watching the sun set through the kitchen window when I first heard it. The melody was hauntingly familiar, something like a lullaby my mother used to sing, but distorted somehow, as if played backward and underwater. It seemed to be coming from the tree line, growing slightly louder with each passing moment. My hands itched to pull back the curtain, to peek outside and see what was making that beautiful, terrible music. I remembered Rule 3. If you hear music from outside, do not look out the windows. It isn't meant for your eyes. The song grew more insistent, weaving my name into its notes. Rachel, it seemed to whisper. Rachel, come see. I gripped the edge of the sink until my knuckles turned white, fighting the overwhelming urge to look. That's when I noticed my reflection in the window had stopped mirroring my movements. While I stood rigid at the sink, my reflection smiled and raised one hand, beckoning me closer. I ran to my bedroom and slammed the door, putting on headphones and playing music at full volume until the sun rose. That night, I dreamed of following the melody into the forest, where shadows danced between the trees, and something with too many limbs conducted an orchestra I couldn't see. The next morning, I found my shoes placed neatly by the front door, caked with mud and pine needles. I tried calling the property management company, but the number only played that same haunting melody before disconnecting. My cell phone still showed no signal, and the landline in the kitchen had started whispering things when I held it to my ear. The incidents escalated quickly after that. I'd wake up to find furniture rearranged in perfect geometric patterns. Water from the taps would run red for exactly 33 seconds before clearing. The photographs on the walls changed subtly, faces shifting position when I wasn't looking directly at them, eyes following my movement through the house. Then came the night the living room light went out. I woke suddenly, awareness hitting me like a physical blow. The familiar glow that usually seeped under my door was gone. Rule 5 echoed in my mind. If you wake up to darkness, something has entered the cabin. The silence was absolute, the kind of quiet that feels like a physical presence pressing against your eardrums. I lay there for what felt like hours, barely breathing, straining to hear any movement in the house. Finally, knowing I couldn't stay in my room forever, I gathered my courage and opened the door. The darkness in the hallway was wrong somehow, too thick, too alive. I fumbled my way to the living room, finding the light switch already in the on position. When I flicked it off and on again, nothing happened. The darkness seemed to pulse around me, breathing in time with my racing heart. That's when I heard it, a whisper so close it could. That's when I heard it. A whisper so close it could have been inside my own head. You should have followed the rules more carefully, Rachel. The voice was familiar, too familiar. Jeremy? I whispered back. The laugh that answered wasn't human. It was a chilling sound, high-pitched and distorted, like a child's laughter played in reverse. I ran back to my room and locked the door, spending the rest of the night huddled under my blankets, shivering despite the warmth of the room. When morning came, the living room light worked perfectly, but something had changed. The cabin felt different now, more aware, more predatory. I began to notice things in my peripheral vision, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, reflections that didn't match reality. Once, I could have sworn I saw myself standing at the end of the hallway while I was in the kitchen. But this other me was wrong. Her eyes were too dark, her smile too wide, and when she lifted her hand to wave, her fingers were just a bit too long. It was around this time that I noticed the guest ledger. I swear it hadn't been there before. The leather-bound book that appeared one morning on the living room table, its spine cracked and pages yellowed with age. I knew I shouldn't read it. Rule number 7 was explicit about that. But after everything that had happened, after seeing my own doppelganger stalking the hallways, I needed answers. The moment my fingers touched the cover, the temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs as I opened the first page, dated 1947. First day as caretaker. Property seems normal enough, though there's something odd about the basement. The door keeps opening on its own. We'll need to check the hinges. The next entry was 3 days later, the handwriting slightly more rushed. Basement door won't stay closed. Heard children laughing down there, but when I checked, nothing. Must be the wind playing tricks. As I turned the pages, the entries became increasingly disturbing. Different handwriting styles told different stories, but they all followed a similar pattern. Initial dismissal of strange events, growing paranoia, and then, the music won't stop. It's so beautiful. Maybe just one look out the window. I keep seeing myself in places I couldn't be. The other me smiles too much. The knocking. Always the knocking. Even when I knock first, it answers. It's getting closer. One entry caught my attention. The ink still looking surprisingly fresh. If you're reading this, you've already broken one of the rules. But maybe that's why you're meant to be here. The cabin isn't just a place. It's a test, a gateway. Those who pass move on to something else. Those who fail. The rest of the page was stained with what looked disturbingly like blood. I slammed the book shut, but it was too late. The damage was done. I'd broken another rule, and somehow I knew the cabin was aware of it. The walls seemed to lean in slightly, the shadows in the corners growing deeper, more purposeful. That night, in what I can only describe as a fit of either bravery or madness, I decided to test the rules further. I deliberately left the basement door open, sitting in the living room to see what would happen. The footsteps started slowly, deliberate steps coming up from the basement, each one making the floorboards creak in a way that seemed almost musical. I ran to close the door, but found it impossibly heavy, as if something was holding it open from the other side. In the darkness beyond the door, I saw movement. Something was climbing the stairs, something that moved in ways a human body shouldn't be able to move. I caught glimpses of too many limbs, of a face that seemed to shift and change with each step. I retreated to my bedroom, listening as the entity moved through the house. The footsteps circled my room 3 times, stopping occasionally as if testing the door. I heard whispers in multiple voices, some I recognized, others that couldn't possibly have come from human throats. Just before dawn, the basement door slammed shut with enough force to rattle the windows. When I finally found the courage to leave my room, I discovered all the furniture in the house had been rearranged to face the basement door. I knew then that I had to leave. The isolation that had once seemed like a blessing now felt like a trap. I planned my escape carefully. I would leave at 5:30 a.m., just after the forbidden hours ended. But when I stepped outside that morning, my blood turned to ice. There, at the edge of the forest, was a figure. Even from a distance, I recognized myself. But wrong, somehow, hollow-eyed and pale, staring back at me with an expression that made my soul shrivel. This other me raised her hand, pointing back at the cabin behind me. The music started again, louder than ever before. When I turned around, I saw dozens of faces pressed against the cabin's windows, faces I recognized from the photographs in the hallway, all watching me with black, empty eyes. I retreated back inside, understanding now that leaving wouldn't be as simple as walking away. Whatever force governed this place had its hooks in me, and it wouldn't let go easily. The next few days became a blur of paranoia and strict rule adherence. I followed every instruction to the letter, hoping that if I proved myself, I would be allowed to leave. The cabin seemed to watch my efforts with amusement, occasionally reminding me of its power through increasingly impossible violations of reality. Doors began leading to different rooms than they should. Windows showed impossible views, sometimes other versions of the cabin, sometimes landscapes that couldn't exist in our world. My reflection stopped appearing in mirrors entirely, replaced by different versions of myself at various ages, all watching me with those same hollow eyes. On what I had decided would be my final night, I heard the music again. It was different this time, clearer, more purposeful. Through the windows I could see a path through the trees, marked by strange floating lights that pulsed in time with the melody. The music called to me, promising answers, promising freedom. Every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to follow the rules. But something deeper knew that this moment, this choice, was what everything had been leading to. At 3:00 a.m., I stepped outside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the night air changed. It became thick, almost liquid, carrying that same metallic taste I'd first noticed in the basement. The music wrapped around me like a physical thing, guiding me toward the tree line where those strange lights hovered. Each step felt both wrong and inevitable. The ground beneath my feet didn't quite match what my eyes saw. Sometimes it seemed yards below me, sometimes inches away. The trees themselves appeared to breathe, their bark rippling like water whenever I looked directly at them. I thought about Jeremy then, about that last day I saw him standing in my classroom after the final bell, how he'd smiled at me, that same hollow smile I'd seen on my doppelganger's face, and said, "Sometimes the only way out is through, Miss Mason." The next morning, they found him in the school library, or what was left of him. The path through the forest twisted in impossible ways. Sometimes I was walking uphill while feeling like I was descending. Other times the path seemed to loop back on itself while still moving forward. The lights leading the way cast no shadows, even when they passed directly overhead. As I walked deeper into the woods, I began to notice things moving in the darkness between the trees, shapes that shouldn't exist, fragments of memories that didn't belong to me. I saw myself teaching classes I'd never taught, to rooms full of students with Jeremy's face. I saw the cabin from different angles, in different times, sometimes pristine and new, sometimes ancient and decaying, sometimes something in between that hurt my eyes to look at. The music grew louder, more insistent. It had words now, though not in any language I understood. Yet somehow I knew what it was saying, almost there, almost home. After what felt like hours, or maybe minutes, time had lost all meaning. I reached a clearing, and there, perfectly maintained and glowing softly in the darkness, stood another cabin. It was identical to the one I'd left, but untouched by time or decay. Warm light spilled from its windows, and smoke curled from the chimney in patterns that spelled out words I almost understood. A man stood on the porch, smiling at me. He looked exactly like the figure I'd seen in my visions, but now I understood why he seemed so familiar. He had Jeremy's eyes. "Welcome home, Miss Mason," he said, opening the door. "You've passed the test." "What test?" My voice sounded strange to my ears, as if it was coming from very far away. "What is this place?" He gestured around us. "A gateway, a crossing point. Those who come here are chosen people who've touched the edge between worlds before. People like you, who've watched someone cross over. People like Jeremy." "Jeremy?" I whispered. "He knew about this place?" The man, or whatever he was, nodded. He was meant to be a caretaker too, but he was too young, too impatient. He tried to force his way through. That's not how it works. The rules exist for a reason. As if in response to his words, the forest behind me erupted with sound, that same haunting music, but distorted now, desperate. I turned to look and saw shapes emerging from between the trees, people, or things that had once been people, all moving in that wrong way I'd seen in the basement, all reaching, all calling. "The ones who failed," my guide explained. "The ones who broke the rules, who looked when they shouldn't have looked, who opened doors that should have stayed closed. They're still here, in their own way, waiting." I thought about the guest ledger, about all those entries that ended abruptly, about the bloodstains on the pages. "And now?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Now you choose. You can take your place here, become a true caretaker, help guide others across when they're ready. Or," he gestured back toward the forest, where the shapes were growing more distinct, more hungry. I looked through the open door of the new cabin. Inside I could see a warm fire burning in the fireplace, comfortable furniture, and walls lined with books. But more than that, I could feel something I hadn't felt since before Jeremy's death. Peace. "What are the rules here?" I asked. He smiled, a real smile this time, not the hollow one from my visions. Just one. "Be true to what you are. You're a teacher, Rachel. You always have been. There will be others like Jeremy, like you. They'll need guidance to cross over properly." I took one last look at the forest behind me, at the shapes that seemed to be slowly fading back into the darkness. Then I stepped through the door. That was 3 years ago. I'm still here, watching through windows that show me more than just the outside world. Sometimes I see new caretakers arriving at the old cabin, each carrying their own burdens, their own reasons for seeking escape. Some of them make it, some don't. The rules remain the same, though now I understand their true purpose. They're not just guidelines for survival. They're tests, filters, ways of determining who's ready to cross over and who needs to stay behind. I keep my own ledger now, but this one isn't stained with blood. It's filled with names, dates, and notes about those who've made it through. Jeremy's name is in there, though not in the way you might think. He did cross over eventually, in his own way. So if you ever find yourself taking a caretaker position at a remote cabin in the mountains, pay attention to the rules. Follow them, not because you're afraid, but because they're showing you the way home. And if you hear music in the night, If you see lights between the trees, well, maybe you're ready to. Just remember, some doors only open one way, and the knocking, it never really stops. It just changes meaning. When I agreed to take a winter assignment at the far northern research station, my friends thought I was insane. They didn't understand the appeal of silence, of solitude, in a place where snow drifted endlessly beneath an unbroken gray sky, but to me it felt like an escape. The isolation was part of the allure, a way to disconnect, to get away from the noise and routines that had become as exhausting as they were predictable. The research station, or Station N1 as it was blandly designated, sat about as far from civilization as I could get without crossing the Arctic Circle. It was a compact structure, built like a bunker, capable of withstanding both brutal winters and months of unrelenting darkness. No town for hundreds of miles, just the station, surrounded by endless snow and silence, buried beneath layers of ice. I arrived in late October, just as the last helicopter out was leaving. The flight team unloaded a few essentials before taking off, the whirring blades slicing the heavy, cold air before they vanished over the horizon, leaving me alone. It was an odd feeling, standing in that empty landscape as the sound faded, knowing that until spring, the only life here would be me. Inside the station was everything I'd expected. Metal walls painted a sterile white, industrial floors, thick steel doors. It had all the charm of an empty hospital ward. The common area had a few couches, a battered coffee machine, and a small television that picked up nothing but static. Further back were the lab rooms, a maintenance shed, and a cramped kitchen stocked with enough supplies to last well past winter. I'd been briefed by the previous technician about my maintenance duties, keeping the generator going, monitoring basic research equipment, and maintaining the security system, which included a network of cameras scattered throughout the station. For the first few weeks, life was peaceful. Days turned into a blur of routine checks, journal entries, and watching snow pile up outside. I'd wake to the deep silence, go through the same steps, listen to the hum of the generator or the occasional creak of metal as the station adjusted to the shifting cold. I kept a log of every day's tasks, details of the station's upkeep, weather changes, and occasional temperature drops that forced me to huddle in thick layers. It wasn't until late November that the unease started to creep in. One morning, a routine task led me to the security room. The cameras were split between the main hallways, the supply rooms, the labs, and a couple of external feeds. The cold had been playing havoc with the equipment recently, causing brief static interruptions that I had to log and monitor closely. Normally I'd check the footage, mark any static, and move on. But that morning something felt off. I clicked through the last 24 hours of footage, moving faster than usual, just skimming. But then I noticed a strange flicker. It was quick, a momentary blur in the main corridor. Thinking it was another static interruption, I slowed the footage, watching carefully. The corridor was empty. The dim light from the overhead panels cast shadows along the walls, stretching down to the storage room doors. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then there it was, a shadow darting across the floor and vanishing just as quickly as it appeared. I leaned forward, feeling a prickle of cold run up my spine. There were no objects in that corridor, no light sources that could cast a moving shadow. My rational side argued that it was likely a trick of the camera, a minor glitch brought on by the cold, which had been relentless lately. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The shadow had moved too deliberately, too smoothly, for a simple camera malfunction. After that, I found myself returning to the security footage whenever I had a few spare minutes. I told myself it was just to monitor the equipment, to catch glitches early and report them, but deep down I was starting to feel that something else was at play. And each time I checked, I found more flickers, subtle movements that seemed to lurk just beyond the reach of the dim station lights. A few days later, the generator faltered. It had been running smoothly since I arrived, but that night I was jolted awake by the absence of its usual hum. The temperature in the station dropped almost immediately, and I grabbed my coat, racing down to the maintenance room. I'd barely gotten the lights back on when the camera feeds came back online, flickering for a moment before returning to normal. I tried to shake it off, blaming the extreme cold and the endless solitude, but I could feel the unease growing. To distract myself, I began reading through old logs left by previous technicians. The notes were routine, mostly documenting small issues with equipment and details about the relentless Alaskan winters. But in one of the older logs, I found a mention of unusual activity in the main corridor, noting that it might be shadows cast by moving objects. The report was vague, but it left me feeling unsettled. No one else had written about it, but somehow the words stuck with me. Curiosity got the better of me one night, and I decided to check the archived footage stored on the server. It was a decision I would regret. I pulled up footage from the previous year, randomly selecting clips to view, feeling like a voyeur digging through someone else's memories. There, on one of the older feeds, I saw something that made my heart pound. It was faint but unmistakable, the figure of a person moving down the corridor. I replayed the clip, feeling my hands grow cold despite the heavy layers I was wearing. It wasn't just a flicker, it was the shadow of a person, moving slowly along the wall, as if they were trying to avoid detection. And then, just as quickly as they'd appeared, they were gone. I told myself that it had to be an error, maybe the shadow of a technician who had left just before I arrived, caught on a faulty camera. But there was something unnatural about the way it moved, as though it was aware of the camera, slipping out of sight just as it approached the edge of the screen. Days passed, and I tried to put it out of my mind. But the seed of dread had been planted. I found myself glancing over my shoulder, feeling a prickling awareness in the back of my mind, as though something was watching, lurking just beyond the edges of my vision. And every time I checked the footage, I half expected to see that figure again, moving through the shadows with a stealth I couldn't explain. One night, the faint scratching started. It was subtle, barely audible over the sound of the generator, like something dragging along the walls just outside my room. I tried to ignore it, blaming my imagination and the isolation. But it grew louder, moving slowly down the corridor toward the storage room. The next morning, I checked the footage again, dreading what I might find. The halls were empty, quiet, as they had been every other night. But as the camera scanned the corridor outside my room, I spotted it again, a dark shape hovering near the door, blending into the shadows as if it were part of them. I watched in horror as it moved toward my door, a slow, creeping presence that seemed to glide rather than walk. It paused outside my room, its shadowy form blurring against the wall. I held my breath, feeling my pulse hammering, as the figure lingered there, unnaturally still. Finally, it melted into the shadows, disappearing around the corner. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath. I staggered backward, cold sweat clinging to my skin, the image of that figure seared into my mind. It was no longer a simple flicker or a trick of the light. This was something deliberate, something aware. By now I was sleeping with a flashlight by my bed, just in case I heard those noises again. Each night, I lay awake, listening to the silence, feeling the weight of the empty station pressing in around me. Every creak of metal, every gust of wind outside, felt like something more. And each time I checked the cameras, I found new flickers, small movements that disappeared as quickly as they'd come. One evening, while scrolling through an archive folder I hadn't noticed before, I discovered a series of video logs. The folder was labeled only with the date, 2013. I clicked on the first log, and the screen filled with the image of a woman, Dr. Lena, the head researcher who had run the station years ago. Her face was calm, professional, and she spoke with a clinical detachment as she documented equipment maintenance and atmospheric readings. But something in her eyes betrayed a hint of fatigue, a faint edge of something darker. Log after log, her demeanor shifted. She grew more anxious, her words more strained. By the third entry, her voice had lost its calm edge, her gaze darting to the sides of the screen as though she were expecting someone to appear beside her. And in one of the final logs, her voice dropped to a whisper. "If you hear it," she said, her eyes wide, "whatever you do, don't look." The log ended abruptly, her face frozen in an expression of fear that felt all too real. I sat back, letting her words sink in, feeling the icy grip of dread settle over me. Dr. Lena's warning clung to me, echoing long after I left the security room. Don't look. Those words hung heavy in my mind, and yet I kept finding myself drawn back to the footage, like a moth to a dim, unnerving flame. I didn't want to look, but the thought of stopping felt worse, like I'd be left defenseless, unaware of what was lurking in the dark spaces I couldn't see. It had been about 2 weeks since I'd first seen the shadow, yet every day seemed to thicken with dread. I'd walk the dim corridors, catching myself glancing at the shadows on the walls or pausing whenever I thought I heard something shuffling beyond the range of the lights. There was no logic to my worry, no solid reason to feel threatened, and yet the feeling of being watched intensified, an invisible presence woven into the silence. One night, determined to understand what Dr. Lena had experienced, I returned to the footage. This time I found an older log buried deep within the archives. As I clicked play, Dr. Lena appeared, seated in the small kitchenette, her face illuminated only by the dim overhead lights. She looked more tired than before, her eyes rimmed with dark circles. "I've done everything by the book," she whispered, her tone hushed as if afraid of being overheard. "I've documented everything, tried to stay rational, but—" She hesitated, then leaned in closer to the camera, her eyes wide and darting to the corners of the room. "Something's here with me. I don't know what it is, but it's watching. Last night I thought I saw it. a figure standing at the end of the corridor. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, but her words trailed off, and she looked away, her expression haunted. "If anyone finds this, just be careful. Don't stay in the main hallway after midnight. And if you hear something, whatever you do, don't look." The screen went dark. Her last words echoed in my mind, refusing to leave me. "Don't stay in the main hallway after midnight." I checked my watch. It was just after 11:30 p.m. A chill crept down my spine, settling like a weight in my chest. The hallway outside my door stretched into the shadows, every creak and groan amplified by the silence. I was alone, yet it felt like the station itself was holding its breath, waiting. That night, I lay in bed, eyes fixed on the clock beside me. I listened, ears straining to catch any sound beyond the hum of the generator. I was drifting on the edge of sleep when I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like something moving slowly along the corridor wall. My pulse quickened, but I kept my eyes shut, refusing to look. The scratching grew louder, echoing through the station as it inched closer to my room. Every instinct told me to open my eyes, to check the monitors. But I clung to Dr. Lena's warning, her voice a steady reminder. "Whatever you do, don't look." After what felt like an eternity, the scratching faded, leaving only silence behind. I stayed frozen, my breaths shallow, waiting for any sign that it had truly gone. Finally, I drifted into a restless sleep, haunted by shadowed corridors and Dr. Lena's voice. The next morning, I woke with a sense of dread heavier than before. I knew I had to check the footage to see if anything had been captured outside my room. My hands shook as I rewound the recording, watching the corridor. It remained still, empty. Then, at exactly 12:06 a.m., a shadow flickered at the far end of the hallway, hovering there for a heartbeat before disappearing. I replayed it, trying to find some rational explanation, but each viewing only deepened the fear gnawing at me. The shadow was human-shaped, shifting slowly, its movements deliberate. It paused, as though aware of the camera, before slipping back into the darkness. My hands trembled as I shut down the monitor, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just glimpsed something I wasn't meant to see, something that defied logic, that lurked in the unseen corners of this cold, empty station. Over the following days, I started noticing other oddities, small things at first, like tools I'd left neatly stacked suddenly scattered, or documents shifted around in the supply room. It was easy to dismiss at first, blaming my own absent-mindedness or the effects of isolation. But when I found the message scrawled in thick black ink on the wall outside the supply room, my heart nearly stopped. "Stay away from the lower levels." The words looked like they'd been there for a while, the ink slightly faded, as though they'd been left by someone long gone. But that made no sense. This was a secure facility, and I was the only person here. I tried to scrub it off, but it left a faint stain, a lingering reminder that someone, sometime, had felt the need to leave that warning. As the days passed, I couldn't resist the pull of the lower levels, despite every instinct telling me to stay clear, to avoid whatever had left that message. My curiosity gnawed at me. I spent hours pacing, standing at the top of the stairwell that led down into the unlit corridor below, feeling the weight of Dr. Lena's words. She hadn't mentioned the lower levels, but something told me that whatever she'd feared was connected to that dark, forbidden space. I tried rationalizing it as a need to investigate, a way to get answers and prove to myself that this was just my mind playing tricks. But as I stood there, staring down into the shadows, I felt a creeping certainty that whatever lay below was waiting, watching, ready to pull me deeper into a darkness I couldn't escape. For now I'd stay away. But the questions gnawed at me, refusing to let go. The lower levels loomed in my mind, a forbidden depth that seemed to call out as much as it warned me to stay away. Every time I passed the stairwell, the darkened entrance appeared to stare back, an endless pit of questions and dread. And yet, despite the warning scrawled on the wall outside the supply room, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Dr. Lena had been here, trapped in the same uncertainty, hinting that something sinister awaited anyone who ventured below. One night, I woke to an unnatural silence. The usual hum of the generator had stopped. My breath misted in the freezing air as I sat up, the biting cold enveloping me. I threw on my thick jacket, grabbing the flashlight by my bed, and cautiously made my way toward the control room to check the generator's feed. The beam of my flashlight bounced off the walls, each shadow stretching and twisting like tendrils of ink, clawing at the edges of the light. As I approached the generator room, the silence was shattered by a sound so sharp and unexpected that I froze mid-step. A scraping noise, slow and deliberate, somewhere in the corridor behind me. Heart pounding, I spun around, shining the flashlight down the length of the hall. Nothing moved, but the sound continued, scraping its way along the walls, growing louder, closer. I gripped the flashlight tighter, every nerve in my body urging me to retreat. But my feet stayed rooted in place. Suddenly I saw it on the monitor screen near the control room. A dark figure appeared at the far end of the hall, hovering just outside the storage room, blending with the shadows as if it were a part of them. I watched in horror as it moved toward my door, a slow, creeping presence that seemed to glide rather than walk. It paused outside my room, its shadowy form blurring against the wall. I held my breath, feeling my pulse hammering as the figure lingered there, unnaturally still. Finally, it melted into the shadows, disappearing around the corner. Only then did I realize I'd been holding my breath. I staggered backward, cold sweat clinging to my skin. The image of that figure seared into my mind. It was no longer a simple flicker or a trick of the light. This was something deliberate, something aware. The next morning, I returned to the footage. I needed to be sure of what I'd seen. My hands shook as I rewound the recording, watching the figure approach, pause, and then disappear. This wasn't some fault in the camera or a shadow caused by a shifting light. This figure seemed to be following a path, as though it knew exactly where it was going. I couldn't shake the feeling that it was looking for something, or maybe someone. Over the following nights, I started sleeping in short bursts, never letting myself drift too deeply into unconsciousness. The moment I heard that scraping sound, I'd jolt awake, clutching my flashlight and listening to the slow, steady rhythm of something gliding along the walls. My nerves were fraying, every inch of me wound tight. Every time I checked the cameras, I half expected to see that figure again, moving with the same eerie deliberation. One night, determined to understand more, I waited by the control room, watching the live feeds intently. At exactly 12:06 a.m., as the entire station was draped in an eerie silence, the figure appeared once more, this time closer. I watched as it drifted along the hallway outside my door, its dark shape blending with the shadows as though it belonged to them. With a trembling hand, I reached for the microphone, my fingers hovering over the switch, and whispered into the silence, "Is someone there?" The figure stopped, turning ever so slightly as if it had heard me. The air felt thick, pressing down on me, as though the shadows themselves were listening, waiting. And then, without a sound, the figure turned and slipped into the darkness, vanishing from sight. I sat there, my mind racing, heart pounding, and a sense of dread settling over me. Later that night, as I tried to process everything, I returned to the archived logs. Dr. Lena's entries became more fragmented, each one hinting at a growing fear. In one of her final logs, she seemed desperate, her voice barely a whisper. It knows we're here. I don't know what it is, but it follows, it watches. We tried staying quiet, but it still finds us. If you're hearing this, stay away from the lower levels. Don't go down there alone. Whatever you do, don't stay after dark." Her last words faded into silence, leaving me in a cold sweat. The lower levels held some dark, twisted secret, something that had driven Dr. Lena to the edge of fear, and now whatever had haunted her seemed to be turning its attention toward me. As I sat there alone in the cold, the weight of isolation pressing down on me, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Each creak of the metal walls, each gust of wind, felt like whispers of something lurking just beyond the light, waiting for the moment I'd let my guard down. The next day I found myself standing at the top of the stairwell, staring down into the darkness below. My flashlight cast a narrow beam, barely illuminating the steps as they descended into pitch black. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but the need to understand was stronger. I took a slow, hesitant step down, the air growing colder with each step, a chill that seeped into my bones. The scraping sound began again, faint at first, but growing louder, echoing off the walls as though it was moving toward me. I stopped, gripping the flashlight so tightly my fingers ached, my heart hammering in my chest. A sudden shiver ran down my spine, and I turned, sprinting back up the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The shadows seemed to press in around me, their presence more tangible than ever. I burst through the door, slamming it shut behind me, breathing heavily as I braced myself against it, listening for any sign of movement beyond. The silence was deafening. The silence was heavy, pressing in like a weight I couldn't shake. Leaning against the door, my breaths were shallow, the frigid air clawing into my lungs. I didn't know what I'd just escaped, but the thought of its presence out there, lurking, felt like a silent threat. In the dimly lit corridors, I sank to the floor, my back against the door, trying to steady myself. Memories of Dr. Lena's final logs played on repeat in my head, her warning about the lower levels now making a frightening amount of sense. It had been clear to her, just as it was becoming clear to me, that something didn't want me there. By morning, the logical part of my mind began to rationalize again. Maybe what I had seen wasn't real. Isolation had a way of warping reality. I knew that much. But even as I tried to convince myself, a gnawing certainty told me I couldn't keep avoiding those lower levels forever. If I wanted answers, and more importantly, a way out of this nightmare, I needed to confront whatever it was. Late that evening I gathered myself, feeling like a man condemned. Armed with my flashlight, I made my way to the top of the stairwell. Shadows clung to every corner, giving the impression of a depth much darker than it truly was. I steeled myself, taking the first step down, each footfall echoing ominously as I descended further into the unknown. At the bottom of the stairwell, the air was colder, the walls slick with condensation. The generator's hum was barely a murmur down here, and the silence felt thicker, more complete. My flashlight illuminated a narrow corridor stretching out before me, leading into a darkness that seemed endless. I moved forward, my steps slow, feeling the weight of every footstep. The scraping sound started again, distant but unmistakable. It was as though something was dragging itself along the walls, inching closer with each breath I took. I clung to Dr. Lena's words in my mind. "Whatever you do, don't look." I reached the end of the corridor, where a single door stood before me. The paint was chipped, and in the thin beam of my flashlight, I noticed faint scratches etched around the frame. My hand hesitated on the handle, but I forced myself to turn it, pushing the door open. The room beyond was a storage area, cluttered with old equipment and covered in a fine layer of dust, as if no one had stepped foot inside for years. I scanned the room, and that's when I saw it, a small notebook resting on a metal shelf. Picking it up, I flipped it open, the brittle pages crackling in the silence. The entries were dated from Dr. Lena's time at the station, but these notes were different from the clinical logs I'd seen before. Her handwriting was frantic, scrawled in uneven lines that hinted at a mind frayed by terror. I keep hearing it, every night. Scraping, dragging. It follows me down the corridor, but when I turn, nothing. It's almost as if it's waiting for me to see it. I swallowed, flipping to the next page. They told us we'd be safe here, that nothing could reach us. But they didn't know. They couldn't have known. The final entry was barely legible, her handwriting erratic and jagged. I saw it. God help me, I saw it. It's right behind you. The words seemed to leap off the page, and I jerked backward, dropping the notebook. My flashlight flickered, the light stuttering as though it too was afraid. A sense of dread washed over me, and I felt an overpowering urge to run, to get as far from this room as possible. As I stepped back into the hallway, a faint whisper brushed against my ear. It was soft, almost gentle, like a breath in the darkness. "Don't look." The voice was eerily familiar. I felt the cold press of terror lock me in place, but I forced myself to move, inching back toward the stairwell. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something at the end of the corridor, a shadow darker than the surrounding black, moving with a strange, gliding rhythm. It was as if the darkness itself was taking form, a figure blending into the very shadows it inhabited. I backed away, careful not to break eye contact with the empty air in front of me, hoping, praying it wouldn't notice. As I turned to flee, the scratching sound intensified, louder, closer. My heart thundered, and I stumbled up the stairs, not daring to look back, not daring to let my fear slow me down. Finally, I reached the safety of the main level, slamming the door shut behind me. my lungs burning, my breath ragged. I felt drained, the cold seeping into me as though it had followed me all the way from below. That night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dr. Lena's final message, her warning etched into my mind. The next day, I checked the footage from the corridor, my hands trembling as I scrolled through the feeds. I almost didn't want to know if the cameras had caught what I'd seen. And then there it was. At precisely 12:06 a.m., the figure appeared, drifting down the corridor with slow, deliberate movements. But this time, it stopped at the top of the stairs, right where I had fled. The shape seemed to pause, almost as if it was waiting, listening. The shadow lingered there for what felt like minutes before turning and slipping back into the lower levels. I shut off the monitor, unable to shake the feeling that whatever this was, it knew. It knew I had seen it, felt its presence, and now, somehow, it was waiting for me to come back. But I knew one thing for certain. Whatever this entity was, it wasn't just a shadow or a trick of my mind. It was real, and it had a purpose, a terrifying intent that went beyond anything I could understand. As I sat alone in the station, I realized I was no longer an observer. I was part of whatever nightmare had been left here, an unwelcome intruder in a game I hadn't meant to play. The darkness had eyes, and they were fixed on me. And in the pit of my stomach, I knew that sooner or later, it would come calling again. The silence of the station had taken on a life of its own, heavy and almost sentient, as though it were conspiring with the shadows to consume me. After what I'd seen, what I'd felt, I couldn't deny it any longer. There was something here with me, something watching, waiting. By day, I wandered the sterile corridors, my own footsteps the only sound. I checked the generator, the storage rooms, the tiny kitchen, all to convince myself of a normalcy that didn't exist. But each evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, that sense of being hunted returned. It was as if the walls themselves leaned in, eager to reveal their secrets to me. One night, desperate for a sense of control, I made my way to the control room and fired up the monitors, reviewing the footage from the previous night. Every camera, every hallway. I needed to know what I was dealing with. For hours I pored over the grainy recordings, hoping, dreading, that I'd see it again. Then, in the footage from the main corridor, I saw the shadow return, slowly gliding past the control room door. It was deliberate, even methodical. The figure paused, looking, searching, almost like it was waiting for something. And that's when I noticed it. The figure had form. It was hazy and indistinct, but no longer just a fleeting shadow. It had a vaguely human outline, limbs moving in careful rhythm as it navigated the halls, pausing here and there. And then it looked up, directly into the camera lens, a dark hollow where a face should have been. I forced myself to keep watching, my pulse thundering in my ears. In those seconds, the figure didn't just glance up, it stared, and in the pit of my stomach, I felt a dreadful understanding settle in. It knew I was watching. My hands trembled as I shut off the monitor. I had to get out. Whatever Dr. Lena had feared, whatever had driven her to leave her last message, it was after me now. I grabbed the emergency survival kit and a heavy coat. My only option was to make it to the supply shed outside and hope I could last in the elements until help arrived. As I crossed the common area, I heard it again, the faint, relentless scraping, like something dragging itself along the walls. It grew louder, following my path through the station. I kept my eyes forward, not daring to look back. I could almost feel it there, waiting in the shadows, keeping pace with my every step. At the exit, I reached for the handle, my hands icy with dread. Just as I was about to push it open, my gaze drifted upward to a message scratched into the doorframe, letters jagged, slashed into the metal, as if in a desperate warning. "You can't leave." My heart raced as I shoved the door open, ignoring the message. The wind outside whipped against me, biting cold, searing my skin as I forced myself to run, stumbling through the knee-deep snow toward the supply shed. The dim lights of the station cast long shadows, and I didn't dare look back. All I could think about was putting distance between myself and that place. I burst into the shed, slamming the door behind me, my breath misting in the frigid air as I sank to the floor, trembling, my back pressed against the cold metal wall. For the first time I felt like I'd escaped. I allowed myself a brief moment of relief, trying to ignore the numbness creeping into my fingers and toes. But then, from somewhere deep within the shed, I heard it, a faint rustling, followed by the unmistakable sound of breathing, shallow, deliberate breaths echoing softly against the walls. I held my own breath, pressing myself harder into the wall, wishing I could disappear. Slowly, I turned my head, flashlight trembling in my hand as I raised it toward the back of the shed. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating boxes, tools, shelves, all empty. But the breathing didn't stop. It grew louder, as if closing in, each breath thick and raspy. And then, as my light passed over an old mirror propped against the back wall, I froze. The reflection didn't match the room behind me. In the dim glass was the control room of the station, the cold, sterile metal walls unmistakable. And standing within it, partially obscured by shadows, was a figure, a dark outline watching me through the mirror, its form flickering like a distorted transmission. With mounting horror, I realized that it wasn't just watching me, it was waiting for me. The breathing grew louder, and I felt the weight of it closing in, pressing me deeper into the freezing shed. But when I turned back, the room was empty, just as it had been before. I was trapped. Trapped in a game I'd never agreed to play, with rules I couldn't begin to understand. As the last of the daylight faded, I understood what Dr. Lena had tried to tell me, the warnings she'd scratched and left behind. Whatever this thing was, it was part of the station, bound to it, living in its shadows. And now, as the dark closed in around me, I knew it had claimed me too. In that final moment I stared into the reflection, meeting the figure's empty gaze. It tilted its head slightly, a mockery of curiosity, or perhaps satisfaction, before it faded into the shadows, leaving only the cold and the silence behind. I never did make it out of that station. Okay, so this is a story I gotta tell. It's been eating at me for a decade, this memory that just won't let go. It's about this crazy trip I took with my friends to an abandoned logging camp in the Alaskan wilderness. It was the summer of 2005, and we were all fresh out of college, ready for adventure. My buddy Mark was obsessed with this old logging camp he'd found on some ancient maps. He was convinced it was this untouched piece of history, just waiting to be explored. It'll be epic, Mark kept saying, his eyes all lit up. Just us, the mountains, and a whole camp to ourselves. The camp was way out in the middle of nowhere, accessible only by this overgrown mining road that cut through miles of forest. The logging companies had given up on the place decades ago. The trees were too big, too remote, not worth the effort. They just left everything behind. Mark had found it while researching for his history degree, and he was determined to see it for himself. He'd already convinced his girlfriend, Julie, to go with him, and now he was trying to rope us in. "Come on, it'll be an adventure," he pleaded. "Think about it, we'll be the first people there in over 50 years. Julie looked a bit hesitant, but she was smiling at Mark like he was the only guy in the world. Our friend Steve, though, wasn't buying it. "You're crazy, man," he said, shaking his head. "Why would we hike all that way just to see some abandoned shed?" "It's more than a shed," Mark insisted. "There are bunkhouses, equipment, even an old steam locomotive." Steve still wasn't convinced, but Jake and I were starting to get interested. As Julie and Mark debated, I looked up at the Alaskan night sky. The stars were incredible, brighter than I'd ever seen them before. Maybe it was the wilderness vibe, but suddenly the idea didn't seem so crazy anymore. "Look, you really think it's still there?" Jake asked. "Couldn't it have collapsed or rotted away by now?" Mark shrugged. "Who knows? Even if the camp is gone, think of the hike. When's the last time any of us did something like this?" I felt this restlessness wash over me. We'd just graduated, and the future was looming: job hunting, rent payments, the whole 9 yards. "I don't know about you guys," I said, "but I'd rather try to find some abandoned locomotive than start filling out job applications." Jake laughed. "All right, I'm in. Let's do this." Steve groaned, but he finally gave in. "Fine," he said. "But if we get eaten by bears, I'm blaming you, Mark." We spent the next week planning and gathering gear. Mark was practically bouncing off the walls with excitement, and the way he was looking at Julie, it was clear this trip was about more than just exploring some old camp. Early one Saturday morning, we loaded up Mark's SUV and headed for the mountains. As we left the paved roads behind, I felt a mix of excitement and doubt. Were we really cut out for this? The mining road was rough, but Mark's SUV handled it like a champ. We bumped along for miles, the forest getting denser and denser. "No turning back now," Jake said, and I could hear the nervousness in his voice. As the sun started to set, Julie asked, "Shouldn't we camp soon?" But Mark was determined to keep going. We drove on, headlights cutting through the darkness, until we finally emerged into a clearing. And there it was, the abandoned logging camp. It was incredible. This huge barn-like structure, bathed in moonlight. We just sat there, speechless, taking it all in. We were the first people to see this place in decades. We reached the logging camp in the late afternoon. The shadows from the trees were already getting long, but we could still see the whole place clearly. Jake let out a low whistle as he took in the sight of the decaying buildings. "Well, I'll be damned," he said. "It really is still here." There were 3 big bunkhouses, a massive barn, and a bunch of rusted machinery scattered around. At the far end, we could see the metal frame of a steam locomotive, half hidden by bushes and weeds. "Told you guys this would be epic," Mark said, grinning. Now let's find a spot to set up camp before it gets dark. We drove to a flat area near the trees and unloaded our gear. The air was damp, and mosquitoes were swarming around us like crazy. "These things are vicious," Steve complained, swatting at his neck. "Mark, there better not be mosquitoes like this the whole time we're out here." Mark just laughed. "We're in their territory now. Just keep spraying that bug spray." Once the tents were up, we went to gather firewood. The woods were quiet, except for the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. It already felt different from any other place I'd been. Steve got a fire going in a stone fire pit, and we huddled around it as the sun went down. We ate our simple dinner of beans and hot dogs, feeling the warmth of the flames chase away the evening chill. "To adventure," Mark said, raising his tin cup of whiskey. We clinked our cups together and laughed. The whiskey warmed me up from the inside, and soon we were swapping stories and jokes. Mark kept scooting closer to Julie on the log they were sharing, and she was leaning into him with a smile. Seeing them like that made me miss my own girlfriend back home. "All right, I gotta know," Jake said, turning to Mark. "How'd you convince Julie to come out to this abandoned camp with you?" Julie blushed, and Mark grinned. "Let's just say I can be very persuasive." "I just asked her to go on a crazy adventure with me," Mark said, giving Julie a quick kiss. Who could say no to that? "Well, I think Julie needs to be checked for insanity," Steve joked. We all laughed, but there was still this underlying tension. We were out in the middle of nowhere, after all. As the fire died down, I started to feel exhausted. We'd been driving and hiking all day, and my sleeping bag was calling my name. "Good night, guys," I said, yawning. I crawled into my tent and snuggled into my sleeping bag. The nylon walls of the tent crinkled in the breeze, and the voices of my friends faded away as I drifted off to sleep. Sometime later, I woke up to the sound of laughter coming from the campfire. The woods were bathed in moonlight, and I could hear my friends still chatting and joking. I smiled to myself, feeling happy and comforted, and drifted back to sleep. The next morning was damp and gray. A thick mist hung between the trees, muffling all sound. I quickly pulled on my boots and jacket, eager to get to the fire. My friends were already up, huddled around a small fire Steve had rekindled. We drank our instant coffee, shivering in the morning chill. "So, what's the plan today?" Julie asked. Mark blew on his hands and looked towards the old buildings. "I want to check out those bunkhouses and see if there's any equipment left inside." Steve groaned. "You mean we have to move? Can't we just sit by the fire all day? Come on. We didn't come all this way just to sit around," Mark said. We finished our coffee and followed him across the clearing. Our boots crunched on the gravel and broken glass as we approached the dilapidated bunkhouse. The front door creaked open, revealing a large room filled with debris. "This must have been where the workers lived," Mark said, his voice echoing in the empty space. The bunk beds were falling apart, and there were no mattresses or blankets. An old wood stove stood against one wall, covered in dust and cobwebs. "No one's cleaned this place in a long time," I said, running my finger through the grime on a windowsill. Julie wandered over to a shelf filled with cracked dishes and cups. "Strange to think people used to wake up here every morning, make coffee, go to work," she said. "All these years later, just left exactly as it was," Steve added. He scratched at some peeling paint on the wall. Mark peered into a locker. Wonder if these would still fit any of us, he said, grinning. Jake was looking at an old typewriter on a desk. Scattered around were weathered notebooks. Looks like these were the logger's daily reports, he said. This one is dated August 13th, 1949. Says, cut down 25 spruce today, mostly young growth. Mosquitoes fierce near the ridge. He trailed off, carefully turning the pages. A strange silence fell over the room as we imagined the workers writing by lantern light, swatting mosquitoes, their daily lives recorded in these crumbling notebooks. I noticed some old photos on the wall. They were black and white pictures of lumberjacks posing with huge logs. Tough-looking bunch, I commented. Mark nodded. They had to be, to work in these conditions every day. I stared at their weathered faces, trying to picture them sitting around at the end of a long day, playing cards and smoking. They were just ghosts now, captured in these fading photographs. Crazy how this was all just left behind, Steve said. Julie shivered. It does kind of feel like we're trespassing, seeing all this. We were quiet again, thinking about the people who had lived and worked here. A half-played chessboard on an overturned barrel, initials carved into a bedpost, stacks of old newspapers, echoes of lives long gone. We should probably get moving, Mark said, breaking the silence. Still more to explore out there. I took one last look around the gloomy room before following my friends back outside. As we walked, I glanced back at our tents. Something about the campsite looked different. I stopped and turned to get a better look. There, among the trees surrounding our tents, were strange markings carved into the trunks. Hey guys, check this out, I said, pointing. What is it? Jake asked. There's something carved on those trees near our tents. Can't really make it out from here, but it looks weird. We walked over to get a closer look. As we got nearer, the markings became clearer. They were definitely not natural. Intricate symbols and lines had been carved into several of the tree trunks. Whoa, these are creepy looking, Steve said, leaning in to examine one. It looked vaguely Celtic, with loops and spirals gouged deep into the bark. Mark ran his hand over another symbol, a circle with a line through it. These almost look like runes or something, he said, glancing around uneasily. Were these here when we arrived yesterday? I shook my head. I don't remember seeing any strange markings. I think I would have noticed something like this near our tents. We exchanged nervous glances. The forest suddenly felt a lot more ominous. Who could have done this overnight? And what did the strange symbols mean? Maybe it was another camping group passing through, Julie suggested, but she didn't sound convinced. Mark examined a few more of the marked trunks. I don't know. These look pretty deliberately carved, not just some random vandalism. The symbols gave me an uneasy feeling, like we were being watched. I half expected to see someone peering out from behind the trees, but all was still and silent. Fan out, guys, Mark said. Let's see if there are any more around here. We spread out, searching for more markings. Found another one over here, Jake called out. We gathered around the deeply etched symbol he was examining. It was a simple circle with a diagonal line through it, different from the Celtic-looking ones. This is really strange, I muttered. Who would come all the way out here just to do this? Mark shook his head. I know. I was excited to find this camp, but I can't imagine another group hiking all the way out here just to carve up trees. We kept searching, and found more carved trunks leading away from our campsite and into the dense forest. They seemed to follow a winding path. I felt a shiver run down my spine as we passed a birch tree etched with a symbol that looked like a spider. Something about these markings disturbed me, like a warning sign in an ancient language. "Guys, I don't like this," Julie said, her voice trembling. "It's like someone was leaving a trail right to our campsite." "Yeah, this is all really creepy," Steve agreed. "Any chance this is your idea of a prank, Mark?" Mark held up his hands. "You really think I'd sneak around carving spooky symbols on trees? This wasn't us." That only deepened the mystery. We were miles from any roads or trails. Was someone else out here in these remote woods? The whole atmosphere felt different now, charged with an unsettling energy. I wanted to pack up and leave, but at the same time I was captivated by the strange symbols. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were clues to something bigger, even if my rational mind resisted such thoughts. Mark pulled out his hatchet and tapped it against a tree trunk. "You know, I'd like to follow this trail a bit and see where it leads. Maybe we can figure out who's doing this." Steve looked like he was about to bolt. "Yeah, I don't know, man. Maybe we should just leave it alone." "I'm with Steve," Julie said, her face pale. "This feels wrong. Let's just go." Mark looked at Jake and me, his eyebrows raised. I understood Julie's fear, but the mystery was too tempting to ignore. "I say we see where the trail leads," I said, ignoring Julie's worried sigh. "As long as we stick together and stay alert, but no splitting up." Mark grinned. "You got it. We'll track this just a bit and see if we can spot anyone else out here." With Jake and me on board, Steve reluctantly agreed to come along. Safety in numbers, I guess. I could tell Julie was nervous as we followed the trail deeper into the shadowy forest, but she stayed close to Mark, her jaw set in determination. The next day was clear and cold, but the chill I felt wasn't just from the weather. It was the lingering fear from the night before. Despite that, I decided to try and go about my normal routine. I needed to check on that tree I'd tried to cut down, maybe try to chop down a new one. With a determined stride, I headed out, axe in hand. As I approached the tree from yesterday, I saw that the dark red sap was still oozing from the cut, staining the ground beneath it. I couldn't help but touch it, half expecting it to have turned back to normal sap. But it was still warm, sticky, and metallic smelling. A rustle in the underbrush made me turn around. I expected to see a squirrel or a bird, but instead, I found myself staring into the eyes of a deer. Eyes that should have been brown were glowing bright red, just like the entity from the night before. I froze. The deer didn't move. It just stared at me with those unnerving red eyes, and it wasn't alone. A rabbit hopped out from the bushes, its eyes glowing red too. A bird landed on a branch overhead, its eyes also burning red. The forest was silent, except for the pounding of my heart in my ears. I took a step back, dropping the axe. The animals didn't run away like they normally would. They just watched me, their red eyes unwavering. I felt a mix of fear and fascination as I slowly backed away and returned to the tower. The forest, once a place of peace and solitude, had become something alien, something unknown. Back in the safety of the tower, my hands were shaking as I reached for the radio. I dialed the frequency for Sam. "Sam, you there?" I asked, my voice shaky. There was a pause. Then Sam's gruff voice came over the static. Yeah, Jake, I'm here. What's up? I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. Sam, I need you to listen, okay? I need you to really listen to what I'm about to say. There was another pause, and then Sam's voice, slightly amused, came back. Okay, Jake, you've got my attention. What's going on? I gripped the radio tighter, as if to give myself strength. It started with the moon, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. It's been hanging low, lower than I've ever seen it before, and it's not its usual color. It's crimson, Sam, like blood. Silence. For a moment, I thought the connection had been lost. Then Sam's voice crackled back. A red moon, huh? Could be an atmospheric thing. I cut him off, urgency rising in my voice. That's not all, Sam. The trees, they're bleeding. I tried to cut one down, and it oozed dark red sap. And the animals, their eyes are red. Again, silence. I could practically hear Sam trying to make sense of what I was saying. And then there's something out there, Sam, I added, my voice dropping to a whisper. It comes at night, glowing red eyes in the dark. It's been watching me every night. Sam's voice came back, full of disbelief. Jake, are you sure you're okay out there? You've been alone for weeks. It can play tricks on your mind, you know. I'm not crazy, Sam, I said, a flicker of anger mixing with my fear. Something's happening here. The forest, it's changing. Sam chuckled, a deep, warm sound that usually calmed me down, but not today. Jake, you've been out there alone for a while now. It's normal to see things differently. I'm not imagining things, I insisted, but there was a tremor in my voice that betrayed my uncertainty. Sam was silent for a moment. Then he spoke more gently. Look, Jake, why don't you take the rest of the day off? Get some rest. And remember, it's just a forest, nothing more. With that, he signed off. I sat there, staring at the radio, his words echoing in my head. As the crimson moon rose again, casting its eerie glow over the landscape, I knew I wouldn't be able to sleep. I couldn't shake off the disturbing encounters of the day. The entity was coming back tonight. I was sure of it. And just as the thought crossed my mind, I saw it. The familiar red glow at the edge of the forest. There they were, the pair of red eyes, glowing brighter against the blood-red backdrop of the moon. But tonight, they weren't alone. There was a shape accompanying the eyes, slowly materializing from the shadows. It was tall, at least 7 feet tall, and humanoid, but with distorted proportions. Its arms were too long, its body too thin, its head turned upwards, towards the tower, and I instinctively stepped back, but I couldn't look away. I saw its face, or rather, the absence of one. There were no discernible features, just those glowing red eyes. It was like looking into a void. As I watched from the tower, the entity started moving. Its movements were unnervingly smooth and silent. It didn't walk, it glided, covering the ground between the forest and the tower with unnatural ease. For a brief moment, it stopped right underneath the tower, its gaze fixed upwards, piercing through the wooden floor and through me. It was as though it could see right into my soul. It stayed there for what felt like an eternity, watching, waiting. Then, as abruptly as it arrived, the entity retreated, its form dissolving into the darkness. The glowing eyes were the last to disappear, a haunting reminder of its presence. I was left alone once more, collapsing onto my cot, the image of the faceless entity seared into my mind. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I watched the vibrant colors of the day surrender to the crimson hues of the night. My heart raced, not with anticipation, but with fear. I knew what was coming, and for the first time since I started this job, I dreaded the night. But I had made up my mind. I couldn't live in fear, hiding in this tower every night. I needed answers. I needed to face whatever it was that lurked in the shadows. Inside the tower, I prepared myself. I picked up my flashlight, testing the beam against the floor. Then I grabbed the flare gun. It was an old model, part of the emergency kit, never meant to be used against whatever that thing was. But it was the only weapon I had. I checked the flare gun, making sure it was loaded. I had a single shot. I didn't even know what I was hoping to achieve. As darkness finally enveloped the landscape, I watched the forest. I waited, my eyes scanning the edge of the trees for the familiar red glow, and sure enough, it appeared. The pair of red eyes, glowing brightly in the darkness, accompanied by the tall, ominous silhouette. But tonight, I wasn't going to hide. I tightened my grip on the flashlight and the flare gun, took a deep breath, and stepped out onto the tower's balcony. There it was, looking up at me, watching and waiting. I shivered, not from the cold, but from the fear that snaked its way up my spine. My heart pounded as I took one last look at the safety of the tower. Then, mustering every bit of courage I had, I descended the steps. Each step brought me closer to the entity. I could feel its gaze on me, an unsettling focus that seemed to pierce through the darkness. It was watching me approach, but it made no move to react. I was a few yards away now, the tower at my back, the entity before me. This was it. With a determined stride, I stepped onto the crimson-tinged ground. The entity was only a few paces away. I could see it clearly now, its faceless form, its elongated arms, and those haunting red eyes. Holding my breath, I raised my flashlight and shone the beam directly at it. The light cut through the darkness, illuminating the entity. It didn't react, remaining eerily still even as the light washed over it. Up close, it was even more unnerving. Its form seemed to shift and ripple, like an illusion wavering at the edge of reality. Ignoring the chill of fear crawling up my spine, I raised my free hand, the one holding the flare gun. "Can you understand me?" I called out, my voice echoing through the silent forest. The entity didn't respond, but it didn't retreat either. "I don't want to hurt you," I continued, swallowing the lump in my throat. "I just want to understand. What are you? Why are you here?" Still no response, just the unblinking crimson eyes staring back at me. The silence stretched on, becoming a palpable presence between us. I clenched the flare gun tighter, my fingers trembling. I took one last breath, feeling the cold Alaskan air fill my lungs. There was a moment of hesitation, a split second where I questioned if I was doing the right thing, but then the entity shifted, its form rippling in the harsh light. It felt like a silent provocation, a threat. It was enough to shatter my doubt. With a newfound resolve, I pulled the trigger of the flare gun. The gun kicked back with a roar, breaking the silence. The flare soared through the air, arcing towards the entity. The light from the flare illuminated the surrounding area, turning the forest into a surreal landscape of reds and blacks. As the light dimmed, I squinted through the dissipating smoke, my heart hammering in my chest. The entity stood there, seemingly unaffected. The flare had done nothing more than create a temporary light show. But there was something different now. The entity was no longer still. It stirred, a slow, deliberate movement that sent shivers down my spine. Its glowing eyes seemed to burn brighter, a piercing red gaze that locked onto me. In the silence of the aftermath, I realized that the entity hadn't retreated. Instead, it had begun to move towards me. I stood there, the spent flare gun in my hand, feeling suddenly vulnerable. Had I made a mistake? As the entity glided towards me, smooth and silent, a wave of terror washed over me. Every instinct screamed at me to turn and run, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Its movements were slow, almost methodical, drawing out the tension. The only sound was my own ragged breathing. It was close now, so close I could almost touch it. But it didn't attack, it just stopped, hovering a few feet away, its luminous gaze fixed on mine. Then, in a moment that made my heart skip a beat, it shifted again. Its form flickered and distorted, becoming even more indistinct. It was as if it was trying to communicate in a language I didn't understand. A chill ran down my spine as I waited for it to make the next move. But it didn't. It just watched me, a silent observer in the crimson night. After what felt like hours, the entity began to retreat. Its form slowly dissolved into the darkness until only the red eyes remained. And then they too faded away, leaving me alone in the crimson-lit forest. As I stood there, the adrenaline fading, I realized I was shaking. With a shuddering breath, I lowered the flashlight. The encounter had left me with more questions than answers. What was the entity? Why was it here? Why hadn't it harmed me? With dawn still hours away, I turned back towards the tower. My legs felt like jelly, and it took all my strength to climb the stairs. Once inside, I collapsed onto the cot, exhausted. But sleep wouldn't come. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind. Those glowing red eyes seared into my memory. For a moment, I considered calling Sam again, telling him about what had happened. But I stopped myself, knowing it would be useless. Sam hadn't believed me the first time. Why would he now? Besides, I couldn't find the words to describe what I had just experienced. Hours passed, and the adrenaline wore off, replaced by fatigue. But sleep remained elusive. Every sound from the forest below made me jump. The usual nighttime noises now seemed menacing. As the night deepened, I decided to step back out onto the balcony. A breeze rustled through the treetops, the sound eerily soothing. I gazed out into the forest, my flashlight casting a narrow beam into the darkness. I saw nothing unusual. The glowing red eyes were gone. The entity was absent. Was it truly gone? Or was it just lurking in the shadows, watching from a distance? Suddenly the silence was shattered by a distant howl. I tensed, shining my flashlight towards the sound. But it was just a wolf, its eyes glowing in the beam. But they weren't red. They were their normal color. Was the forest returning to normal? Or was this just the calm before another storm? As the first rays of dawn began to paint the sky, I breathed a sigh of relief. I had made it through the night. The forest, for now, seemed calm. The animals were behaving naturally, and the entity was nowhere to be seen. There was a sense of normalcy, and I clung to it, seeking comfort in the familiar sights and sounds. Despite what had happened, I had a job to do. With the coming of daylight, my fear subsided enough to let me focus on my work. I spent the day in the tower, scanning the forest for any signs of fire. But as the day progressed, I couldn't help but remember the bleeding trees. I decided to venture back into the forest, driven by a mix of fear and curiosity. The axe felt heavy in my hand as I approached a small tree. My palms sweated as I remembered the dark red sap from the day before. I made a small cut, bracing myself for what might come. But instead of the eerie red sap, the tree bled clear, normal sap. Relief flooded me. It was as if the forest had returned to its natural state. The animals behaved normally, the trees bled clear sap, and the entity was nowhere to be seen. Yet, as the sun began to set, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The entity could return. I knew that. The quiet day might just be a deceptive pause. As darkness blanketed the forest, I watched with bated breath. I was bracing for the same crimson hue, the same menacing glow. But tonight, the moon looked normal. It hung high in the sky, bathing the forest in its soft, natural light. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, their forms casting long, ordinary shadows. The forest was beautiful, calm, almost serene. Hours passed with no sign of the entity. No glowing red eyes, no ominous form. A sense of relief washed over me. Maybe it was over. Maybe the entity had moved on. Or maybe it was never really there at all. Could it have been a figment of my imagination? A trick of the light? The thought was comforting, but deep down I knew what I had seen was real. Despite the tranquility, I couldn't shake off the lingering fear. The entity's absence didn't mean it was gone. It might return tonight, tomorrow, or any other night. The uncertainty kept me on edge, but for now all I could do was appreciate the peace. For the first time since starting this job, I truly took in the beauty of the wilderness around me. The tranquil night, the rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, all wrapped in the soft, silver glow of the moon. The night passed without incident. No red sap, no glowing eyes, no mysterious entity. Just a normal night in a remote fire watchtower in Alaska.